This poor soul had already pushed himself to the absolute limit. He was the laughingstock of the server for picking the gunslinger class. To everyone else, it was nothing but a bottom-tier, trash-tier joke of a profession. Little did they know, it was secretly a god-tier legendary hidden class. But before his grand awakening could even begin, his previous life was a literal dumpster fire of misery. He watched in agony as his sister was erased from existence right before his eyes. Lu Jin was paralyzed, forced to witness the horror in total helplessness. Thugs sneered at him with pure disgust as they trampled his sister. He could only sob, too weak to even crawl to his feet. In that moment of despair, a cold blade tore through his flesh from behind. The bastards cackled, brutally kicking him and his dying sister like trash. Mocked as a pathetic weakling, Lu Yi clung to his last breaths, drowning in the bitter regret of a wasted life. His only dream in that cruel world was simply to keep his sister safe. He never imagined the game Zhong World would merge with reality, dragging everyone into its nightmare. Every player was suddenly granted the exact powers and stats they held within the game. Since he had barely touched the game, he was reincarnated as a bottom-feeding weakling. Yet, fueled by a gigachad level of pure, unadulterated rage, he refused to let those thugs spit on his sister's memory. Lu Yi forced himself up. With a primal roar, he swung his blade with everything he had, burying the steel deep into that bastard skull. He collapsed into the dirt, finally ready to welcome the cold embrace of death. But then, the laws of the universe shattered. The impossible happened. He woke up in his own bed, 3 years before the apocalypse, staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize. It dawned on him that he was back in his old apartment from years ago. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open, and a familiar female voice cut through the silence. Lu Yi froze, his heart nearly stopping. Standing right there in the hallway was his sister, alive and well. She was holding a package containing the official access for Zhong World. With a trembling voice and a racing heart, he desperately asked her what year it was. Lu Yun, baffled by his intensity, joked that he must have woken up on the wrong side of the bed before saying it was 2030. That answer hit him like a physical shock. Lu Yi stood there petrified, unable to process the miracle he was hearing, bolting upright like a man possessed. He lunged toward the window, his jaw dropping at the sight outside. He had regressed to the exact day Zhong World first went online. Without a second thought, he pulled his sister into a fierce embrace. He swore a silent, blood-bound oath. This time, he wouldn't let them die. He would become the ultimate apex predator, even if this was just a fleeting dream. It was July 27th, 2030. The VR phenomenon Zhong World launched, and by September 1st, it had completely seized control of the globe, and every player was infused with the supernatural abilities of their avatars. The outcasts and the dregs of society were reborn as titans overnight. For the first time, they tasted absolute power, igniting a firestorm of chaos and eternal wars fueled by greed and the thirst for dominance. Our hero had originally played as a mere casual explorer, a choice that led to his ruin. Being low-level meant he was just fodder in Zhong World. However, by some twist of fate, the goddess of luck finally smiled upon him. He was reborn, since spiraling 3 years back into the past. Returning to the brink of the game's launch, he was now possessed by a steel-hard determination to reach the top. Back in the present, his sister pushed him away, weirded out by his sudden, tight hug. She blushed furiously, thinking her brother was just being a massive creep. Rubbing the back of his neck, he gave a sheepish grin, playing off the shock of his own actions. Fast forward 8 hours to the official server opening of Zhong World. Our protagonist donned his VR gear and settled onto the bed for the dive. He knew he had a mere 34 days before the game consumed reality. He had to become the strongest in that window to ensure their survival. He materialized in the starter plaza amidst a sea of players. In the center, an admin was showcasing the raw power of the strength stat. A casual first swing effortlessly cleaved a massive boulder in two. However, as the admin focused his inner energy, he unleashed a second strike that moved like a blur, slicing through solid rock as if it were soft butter. The sheer display of power sent a wave of shock through Lu Yi. He watched the spectacle, wide-eyed and breathless. Once the tutorial concluded, the system beamed our protagonist directly into the heart of the game world. At the spawn point, players gaped at the breathtaking landscape, But Lu Yi had zero interest in sightseeing. His only goal was rapid evolution. He poured his points into the strength attribute, the most enigmatic stat that separated fodder from true legends. Wasting not a single second, he bolted for the training pavilion. In Zhong World, there were no locked-in classes, only mastery levels based on the weapons you wielded. Knowing this, Lu Yi sought to master his craft instantly, as weapon proficiency was the cornerstone of true power. 5 days flew by, and while top-tier players were likely hitting level 30, he was still grinding at level 1. Staring at the endless rows of weaponry, Lu Yi felt a crushing weight in his chest. With so many choices and so little time before the world changed, he briefly doubted himself, until the nightmare of his sister's death flashed before him. The memory of that level 20 murderer flashed in his mind, and his blood turned to boiling lava in his veins. There was no turning back now. Without overwhelming power, he was nothing. Taking a steadying breath, he gripped his pistol and began the grind. Even if death was his destiny, he would go down swinging. Meanwhile, back at the pavilion, the girl who had previously laughed at his obsessive training decided to check if he'd finally given up. But when she peered inside, the training hall looked completely deserted. She scoffed, assuming the loser had finally tucked tail and run for good. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the building. The thunderous boom rooted her to the spot in fear. What kind of monster could make that sound? Driven by curiosity, she followed the echoing blasts up the stairs toward the firearms pavilion. Peeking through the door, her jaw hit the floor. Lu Yi stood amidst the wreckage of a completely pulverized target. A mysterious green aura pulsed around him, as if he were rewriting his own DNA. The girl stifled a scream with her hands, her eyes wide with terror. What kind of transformation was she witnessing? Lu Yi stood motionless, staring into the void as if his soul had left his body. In reality, he was staring at the notification he had bled for. The screen flashed. Congratulations. You have achieved 100 pistol mastery. New skill unlocked as a reward. A surge of adrenaline raced through him. He finally had his edge, and for the first time, he felt ready for the coming storm. A dark, confident smirk crossed his face. The path was set. It was time to level up and slaughter his way to the top. His stats were mostly baseline, except for a single point in special resistance. A new passive skill slot had opened, though it was currently empty. He turned toward the exit, ready for the hunt. However, as he reached the doorway, he spotted the girl loitering in the hall. She tried to play it cool, looking away and whistling a tune to pretend she hadn't been spying. Lu Yi didn't care enough to call her out. He walked right past her, as if she were a ghost. The girl, left in his wake, felt a sudden, burning embarrassment. A wave of annoyance hit her. She couldn't understand why his presence made her so flustered. She burned to ask about the explosion and that aura, but her pride held her back. She stood there in a stunned, heavy silence. Leaving the pavilion, Lu Yi realized that only the perfect weapon could unleash a player's true potential. With that goal, he hit the equipment shop for a gun, rounds, and a blade. He caught whispers of Zhong World hitting 10 million active users, a grim reminder that the clock was ticking faster than ever. Inside the shop, Lu Yi meticulously picked his starting loadout. He bought a low-tier, white dragon pistol for 500 coins, 300 rounds for 300 coins, and a basic knife for 200. His entire 1,000 coin starting budget vanished in an instant. He stepped out feeling the sting of the high prices. The exchange rate between game gold and real money made every purchase feel like a robbery by the developers. Regardless, he finally had the tools he needed to start his revenge. As he examined his new knife, a brilliant idea sparked in his mind. Without a moment's delay, he triggered his hidden ace. Weapon Master. This broken skill allowed him to ignore all gear restrictions and fuse the attributes of his weapons together. The first true trial of his godlike power was finally here. Locked and loaded, Lu Yi made a beeline for the Mirror Kingdom facility. That place gave players the chance to fight a perfect shadow clone of themselves. The deal was simple. Slay your mirror self for massive XP and gold. The catch? You had to fight a clone 5 levels higher than yourself, and fork over 10 of your gold just to enter. For Lu Yi, those risks were irrelevant. It was the ultimate shortcut. He was level 1, but he held the power of a legend. As he stepped in the Mirror Kingdom lobby, a scream of pure frustration tore through the air. 2 players stumbled out of the respawn point, cursing the insane difficulty of the shadow clones. It looked like they had just been stripped of everything they owned. A pair of nearby players watched with mocking grins. They sneered at the losers and quickly locked their sights on Lu Yi. One spotted the pistol tucked into his belt and burst into laughter, ridiculing it as the absolute trash-tier weapon of the game. The other player joined in the mockery, convinced Lu Yi was just another clueless noob delusional enough to think he could survive with such bottom-tier junk. Lu Yi kept his mouth shut, coldly observing them. These fools had no clue about the monster he was becoming. After locking in his choice, Lu Yi braced himself for his first blood in the Mirror Kingdom. He knew his lack of combat experience made him the underdog, but retreat wasn't an option. He swiped through the system menu to get a feel for the interface, and after a moment of navigating, a final prompt popped up, demanding confirmation to engage a mirror player. Despite the cold sweat prickling his skin, Lu Yi hit confirm, fully aware that a single mistake could cost him everything. The system pinged for a 100 coin entry fee. Once he paid, a final warning flashed. In the Mirror Kingdom, it's a fight to the finish. No exits until a winner is decided. Within seconds, the world blurred and Lu Yi was warped directly into the combat arena. His opponent materialized, fully armed and ready for slaughter, as the countdown began to tick away. 10 seconds left until the dance of death. When the clock hit 5, Lu Ye's nerves flared up. He had never initiated a fight in his life, and the crushing weight of the confrontation felt like lead in his chest. His leg began to shake uncontrollably, a physical betrayal that threatened to break his focus. He slammed a hand onto his thigh to steady the tremor, but that split-second distraction cost him the opening move. His shadow clone charged instantly with a blood-red blade. Lu Yi thought it was game over, but by some miracle of instinct, he managed to narrowly dodge the lethal arc. He scrambled to fire back, but his nerves were shot. Every single bullet whistled harmlessly into the air. Stumbling and nearly hitting the dirt, he couldn't stop the enemy's relentless advance. The clone exploited his opening and disarmed him with a swift, brutal strike. Now standing empty-handed, Lu Yi was forced to face the cold steel of the red sword with nothing but his bare fists. The enemy moved in for the kill, smelling victory. But in that moment of absolute despair, Lu Ye's eyes sparked. This was his second chance at life, and he refused to die like a dog again. He slammed the Weapon Master skill button. Suddenly, he seized the sword, rewriting its very properties on the fly. With a massive surge of strength infused into the blade, Lu Yi parried the killing blow as if it were nothing. The overloaded power of the weapon let him counter with a ferocity he never knew he had. With surgical precision, he sliced clean through the enemy's sword, leaving his opponent holding nothing but a broken hilt. He ended the fight in a heartbeat, but even with the win, Lu Yi was a vibrating mess of adrenaline. His hands were still trembling like leaves, and his lungs burned for air. His body hadn't caught up to his victory yet. He felt a surge of self-loathing, frustrated that a single fight had left him so shaken after such a clean win. Meanwhile, just a few minutes earlier, 2 veteran players were scouting the arena for fresh talent. They were complaining about how the big clans were monopolizing the Mirror Kingdom, while Lu Yi was busy wrapping up his impossible victory. The 2 scouts watching from the sidelines were left absolutely speechless. They couldn't wrap their heads around how a level 1 noob with garbage gear just took down a shadow 5 levels higher. In reality, these 2 weren't just scouts. They were high-stakes gamblers. One of them frantically pulled up the backstage garden betting site to check the payout, while the other dissected Lu Ye's footage, obsessed with his movements. Lu Yi, however, was already eyeing his next target, strikers. As the next timer ticked down, the green-haired scout whispered that they'd found a gold mine, while his partner grinned. They were glued to the screen, waiting to see which suicidal matchup Lu Yi would pick next so they could bet the house. Lu Yi checked his status. He'd jumped to level 5, and his raw stats had doubled across the board. But to him, he still felt like fragile glass. He knew he had to forge himself into a weapon and kill his inner fear, or the world would eat him alive. With a hardened gaze, he scrolled past the easy prey and locked onto his next victim. Ranked 55th in the tier, a monster known only as strikers. The system didn't wait, warping him back into the heat of the arena instantly. The 2 gamblers were salivating, ready to drop their coins on the mystery kid. But their faces went pale when they saw who stepped out of the shadows. They nearly choked when they realized Lu Yi had challenged the level 10 nightmare strikers. The green-haired boy, snapping out of his trance, realized Liu Yi had bypassed hundreds of weaker clones to pick the apex predator of the level 10s. He panicked, praying his massive bet hadn't been locked in yet. But his white-haired buddy groaned. The money was already gone. He just hoped that when they lost, nobody would find out they were dumb enough to bet on a level 5 kid. The bookie announced the live odds, showing a massive mountain of cash stacked against Liu Yi. Looking at the numbers, the two friends felt their hearts sink. With over 200,000 coins betting on strikers, they felt like they'd just thrown their money into a fire. At that precise moment, strikers materialized with a deadly katana decked out in the high-tier persistent fighter set. Against him stood Liu Yi, a mere level 5 with a basic pistol and a cheap knife. As the duel started, Liu Yi's legs began that pathetic shaking again. He was disgusted by his own weakness. To kill the fear once and for all, he brutally drove his own dagger into his thigh. With 2 seconds on the clock, he ignored the pain and dropped into a low stance, swearing he wouldn't fumble this like the last time. The moment the start flashed, Liu Yi became a blur, charging strikers head-on and dancing through a storm of blade strikes. Liu Yi's pistol packed a punch, but his aim was shaky. Strikers deflected the bullets with his steel as if he were swatting flies. Tiring of the game, strikers surged forward and disarmed Liu Yi in one clean motion, immediately pivoting for a decapitating strike. There was no room to dodge, but Liu Yi refused to let the curtain fall. He burned his special skill to the max, and his eyes ignited with a piercing blue glow. He performed a gravity-defying leap, the katana's edge missing his throat by a hair's breadth. Skidding across the arena floor, he saw strikers momentarily pause. Seizing the breathing room, Liu Yi checked his vitals. His HP was a measly 20/2000, and his mental energy was nearly tapped out at 28/30. The fight had just started, but he was already standing at death's door. His basic attacks were like mosquito bites to the boss. He realized he had bitten off way more than he could chew. He should have played it safe and farmed the weaklings to level up properly, but it was too late for regrets. Liu Yi stood back up, a dark laugh escaping his lips at just how insane the odds were. He knew the only way to kill his fear was to walk through the fire. Standing still was just a slower way to die. He lunged forward, a final, desperate suicide charge toward the enemy. In the blink of an eye, our hero twisted his body mid-air to avoid a killing blow. That would have wiped out his remaining sliver of health. However, Strikers was a demon of speed in a heartbeat. The clone was already at his back. Caught off guard, Liu Yi knew he was out of moves, so he gambled his entire existence on one final shot. He spun around, pressed the muzzle of his pistol against Striker's chest, and pulled the trigger. They traded fatal blows. The katana tore through Liu Yi's torso just as the pistol blast vaporized Striker's head. The system calculated the frame-perfect kills and ruled that Liu Yi's damage landed first. Victory was his. A fountain of XP and gold rained down as he leveled up instantly. The transformation was immediate. Liu Yi felt a surge of new power coursing through him. Now at level 13, his stats skyrocketed to 17, with only his resistance lagging behind by a single point. He let out a long, shaky breath, realizing he'd just danced with the Reaper and won. A flood of notifications hit his screen, the biggest one being that reaching level 10 had evolved his rebirth perk into a path of choice evolution system. Outside, the two gamblers were being cornered against a wall by a furious mob. The losers were being forced to cough up every cent they had. One guy was practically begging to keep half his money, but a scarred thug glared at them with one eye, growling that there were no discounts for losing bets. They were paying up or else. The white-haired gambler snapped, screaming that the results weren't official yet and to shut their mouths. The thug pointed at the leaderboard, barking that Strikers was a level 10 god and couldn't possibly lose to a random. He was ready to burn the place down if he lost. But before he could finish, Strikers was the undisputed king of the level 10 clones. However, a second later, the board flickered. The arena went dead silent as Strikers, defeated, flashed in neon lights. The crowd stood there like statues, jaws hitting the floor as their fortunes evaporated in an instant. The green-haired kid's face lit up like a Christmas tree, radiating pure joy. The two friends hugged each other, drowning in the massive payout they'd just scored. Meanwhile, Liu Yi, the man of the hour, stepped out of the arena as a conqueror. A mysterious new list appeared before his eyes. He didn't quite grasp what it was yet, so he decided to call it a day and log out. Just as he pulled the headset off, his sister walked into the room, her voice a warm reminder of reality, calling him for dinner. Lu Yi swept into the kitchen like a whirlwind and began devouring his meal. His sister, Lu Yun, mentioned she'd cooked up his favorite mushrooms, but he was in a total trance, his mind already diving back in his Zhong world to analyze the two hidden skills he'd just stumbled upon. First up was Invasion Flame, a skill that hit like a freight train. While the damage per second dipped from 50 to 25, the stacking burn damage could melt a target for a staggering 250 HP. But beyond just his kit, Lu Yi was busy calculating the threat levels of his rivals and realizing he'd need to scout his own elite-tier squad to stay on top. Slamming down his utensils after finishing in record time, he tossed a quick thanks to his sister and bolted for his room, leaving her blinking in confusion since he'd barely touched his plate. The cold shoulder definitely stung her pride a little. She let out a heavy sigh, muttering that if he was going to be this obsessed, he'd better find someone else to be his personal chef. Now, we warp back into the digital chaos of the Mirror Kingdom in Zhong World. A broken player was groveling at Gonshi's boots, desperately begging to keep at least half his gold as they'd first agreed. But Gonshi wasn't feeling merciful. The man kept sobbing, explaining that the money he'd blown on strikers didn't even belong to him. It was his family's life savings, and losing it meant a death sentence. Gonshi just sneered, mocking him, saying he'd already rejected that pathetic plea a minute ago and was getting tired of the broken record. But before he could finish his power trip, a red-haired silhouette blurred in and slammed Gonshi's skull into the stone wall. The newcomer demanded every cent lost in the strikers bet be returned immediately. This was Jack, a high-ranking enforcer from the New Order Guild that ruled the Mirror World. Ganshi was pinned like a bug against the bricks. He frantically stammered that the kid who beat strikers was a total stranger. He just placed a lucky bet and never dreamed a level 13 noob would actually execute the striker's copy. But Jack didn't give a damn about excuses. He coldly noted that the white-haired kid was the only one who walked away rich, and even if Gonshi dodged the bullet in-game, the real world wouldn't be so forgiving. Desperate to avoid being hunted down in reality, Gonshi offered up his entire jackpot as a peace offering. Jack, however, suddenly let him go, claiming he didn't need the petty cash. Gonshi froze for a second, his face turning deadly serious as he realized he had nothing else left to pay his debt. Jack flashed a predatory grin, mentioning a favor Gonshi would eventually owe him. With a blade at his throat, the man had no choice but to sign his soul away. Back to our regressed hero. Post-dinner, he dived back into the VR world to resume the grind. Knowing he couldn't slack off, when the apocalypse hit reality, he had to be the one holding the leash. A system chime echoed, confirming his choice to evolve the Karaki skill. Without a moment's hesitation, he smashed the upgrade button. Instantly, a trio of alerts flooded his vision. The details of his evolved skill, an account update showing his combat power had spiked to 15.6, and a new title, Low-Level Warrior. But the real shocker? This skill granted a dual attribute synergy that sent his stats into the stratosphere. Opening his status window, he was floored by the sheer jump in his raw power. Back in his past life, even at level 100, he felt like a weakling, but he was finally starting to see the bigger picture. Despite being a lowly level 13, his new buffs and stats meant he could go toe-to-toe with a level 26 powerhouse. Lu Ye's mind began to race. He wondered if he could now absolutely dominate a level 20 strikers with pure, unadulterated strength. No longer the shaky kid, Lu Yi had evolved into a confident predator, determined to hunt strikers down again just to see where his ceiling was. The dual prompt appeared. Challenge strikers? He slammed accept without blinking. The moment he locked in the match, the betting lines in every dark corner of the game and the world chat went absolutely nuclear. Amidst the chaos of the players, someone decided to bet the farm. Two guys, acting on Jack's secret orders, started fueling the hype train. One of them dumped his entire net worth on our protagonist's head. This sent the blonde guy into a panic. They didn't need to gamble everything, but the white-haired boy was betting that Jack couldn't touch them now, especially since he wouldn't get any backup from the New Order higher-ups for this mess. The blonde noticed his partner's cocky smirk and put the pieces together. Jack had basically forced them to leak the rigged odds in favor of the MC. He still didn't get it, though. Who would be dumb enough to bet against Lu Yi now? But the boy stayed silent. His only mission was to stir the pot and watch it boil. The camera shifts to the Mirror Kingdom arena with the 10-second countdown ticking toward 0. On one side, The level 20 strikers, a monster armed with twin katanas and high-spec plate armor. On the other, level 13 Liu Yi, standing there with a basic pistol, a rusted dagger, and starter rags. Liu Yi began to simulate the fight, thinking that with his boosted cognitive power, he could predict the exact microsecond to tear strikers apart. The system roared, "Battle start." Our MC didn't wait for an opening. He created one, launching a high-speed offensive immediately. Strikers parried the lead, katanas blurring to deflect every bullet while diving for a counter. Liu Yi kept the pressure on, realizing his duel stats had completely closed the level gap. His confidence hit a new peak. Fights against high-level elites weren't the desperate survival struggles they used to be. Swaying like a ghost, Liu Yi danced around the arena, using only his pistol, marveling at how his movements had become so fluid. He lured the enemy into striking range, then pressed the barrel of his gun against Striker's forehead, looking to execute him in the final seconds of the round. With a cold smirk, he was a heartbeat away from pulling the trigger and ending the massacre. Strikers, for his part, was paralyzed. He couldn't believe a low-level trash player was actually hunting him, and he stood frozen, unable to find an escape. But looking into his opponent's eyes, Liu Yi hesitated. A shadow of doubt clouded his mind, and he lowered his weapon at the last second. Because the hero had slowed his momentum, Strikers had a wide-open window to counter, but Liu Yi backflipped away just in time, escaping without a scratch. But then, a tidal wave of fury hit him as he remembered who he was fighting. He stopped dead, clutching his head in frustration, suddenly unsure of his next move. He couldn't fathom why his finger had frozen on the trigger. He wondered if the soul-crushing fear of death for his past life was still haunting him. Staring at his enemy and his own trembling blade, the boy realized he'd never be the master of his own fate if he let a digital ghost stand in his way. White-knuckling his weapon, he knew his entire future was being weighed on this single moment. Across the arena, the girl watching also knew that this clash would only leave one man standing, and the protagonist's life was dangling by a fraying thread. With a massive, explosive leap toward Strikers, both warriors decided to settle it in a head-on collision. Strikers swung first, a lethal arc meant to take Liu Yi's head, but our hero moved like a phantom, phasing through the attack and appearing at his back. He grabbed the clone by the skull, pressed the steel to his temple, and in that instant, the fog in his mind cleared. He had already transcended. He wasn't the weakling from the past anymore. He was a god in the making. Without a shred of hesitation, Liu Yi pulled the trigger. 3 system pings flashed, Strikers was erased, his level soared, and he finally hit level 20, unlocking the ultimate path to specialize his god-tier power. The protagonist's expression was stone cold. He finally realized he hadn't just grown. He was now light years ahead of the rest of the world. Meanwhile, in the betting lobby, the gamblers who put their faith in our hero couldn't believe their luck. They had just hit the motherlode. Then, out of the blue, the green-haired boy noted that while the bets were settled, he'd opened a second secret line on the level 20 Strikers, and seeing Liu Yi win meant everyone now knew his strength was completely game-breaking. The boy began theorizing that after stomping a level 20 boss, Liu Yi must be level 22 or 23 already. He calculated that Liu Yi would only find a real challenge against the level 30 mirror copies, where the stakes were legendary. Our hero knew the name Strikers all too well, but the boy couldn't fathom how Liu Yi was so confident about taking down a level 30 version. They assumed the second the MC stepped up to a level 30 Strikers, he'd be served on a silver platter. As Liu Yi warped back into the Mirror Kingdom, he felt the gap between him and the rest of the world widening into a canyon. Glancing at the leaderboard, he locked his eyes on the level 30 mirror copy of Strikers sitting at the very top of the food chain. If the last fights proved he was stronger than the average player, now he had to dismantle the level 30 Strikers, the one version every player in the game swore was invincible. Rumors were already flying. Stories of whales who reset their entire accounts just to try and kill this boss, only to get slaughtered. Strikers was the invincible copy because it was this specific AI that built the New Order Guild's empire. Hearing this, Liu Yi simply pulled up his menu, his eyes burning with a killer instinct. He was starving for the taste of an impossible fight. The system asked one final time if he was truly ready to step into the ring with the level 30 Nightmare Strikers. He didn't even blink as he hit confirm, and the world dissolved around him. Jack, watching from the shadows, Barquette orders to his lackeys to open the floodgates on the betting lines for Stryker's guaranteed win. We cut to our two betting buddies. One of them suddenly went all in on our protagonist, making the green-haired guy lose his damn mind. He was convinced Liu Yi had a 0 survival rate against a level 30 boss. But the white-haired boy just tuned him out, stating with total conviction that he was riding with Liu Yi to the end. Seconds later, they were in the arena where the final boss awaited. The level 30 strikers stood there, gripping a legendary katana called Last Will and wearing the fierce armor set. Meanwhile, Liu Yi sat at level 23, equipped with a basic pistol, a cheap dagger, and noob gear, looking like a lamb heading straight for the slaughter. After a tense silence, a system chime hit Liu Yi. His intelligence stat had just broken 100, granting him a +1 bonus to his cognitive power. Deep in the menus, Liu Yi didn't even see the start flash. Strikers didn't wait, blitzing him in a heartbeat and carving 411 HP right off his bar. Liu Yi was stunned. He was left with a measly 18 HP. He couldn't believe a bot could move with such terrifying, godlike speed. The follow-up strike should have been the end of his story, but somehow, he managed to catch the blade with his dagger and survive by a hair. With every breath, Liu Yi's annoyance grew, finally realizing the sheer gravity of this life-or-death struggle. If his reflex had been a millisecond slower, he'd be a corpse without even having the time to pop a potion. With a roar of effort, he shoved the attack back and slid into a retreat, opening fire with his pistol. Every single shot was aimed with lethal, pinpoint accuracy. Liu Yi was done playing games. He wanted this over now. However, his attempts to draw blood were useless. Strikers wove through the bullets effortlessly, looking like he was moving in a world where time had stood still. With one explosive step, Strikers was back in his face, blade raised to end the duel in a single stroke. Liu Yi hadn't expected this kind of pressure, but to his shock, even as his dagger barely grazed the boss, he still managed to draw a sliver of blood. He forced our MC to spam healing potions like a madman just to keep his soul in his body. Liu Yi was drowning under the sheer weight of the assault, and in the blink of an eye. If he hadn't pulled off some god-tier maneuvers, he'd be nothing more than a stain on the floor right now. Somehow, he clawed his way back, weaving through a storm of steel to duck Stryker's killing edge. Retreating to a safe distance, Liu Yi immediately started raining lead again, trying to crack Stryker's defense with his pistol. A sudden chill hit him. He realized that even with level 46 stats, this pressure was on a whole different level. But shaking off the shock, Liu Yi's eyes burned with resolve. He knew if this was the absolute peak of Stryker's legendary power, then he just had to unleash hell for a few seconds to secure that sweet victory. That's when he played his trump card, Blessing Study. This broken skill sent his stats into the stratosphere for 60 seconds. He also analyzed the curse side, a nightmare kit that could inflict 10 different debuffs from aging and poisoning to total mental insanity. The screen flashed, Blessing acquired. His base combat power hit 15, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The boy's raw attributes multiplied like crazy, giving him a monstrous advantage over the copy. Liu Yi let out a primal roar as the blessing surged. He wasn't going to win with levels, so he bet his entire life on pure, unadulterated stats. The system pinged. 400 cognitive power burned to boost every attribute by 200 for one glorious, godlike minute. A terrifying white aura erupted around him, chilling the blood of anyone watching. This was the power of a true predator. He knew that within these 60 seconds, he could absolutely pulverize Strykers into digital dust. Sensing the shift in the air, Strykers hesitated for a split second before deciding to strike first. The bot lunged at maximum speed, desperate to end Liu Yi before this transformation became his own funeral. Liu Yi Simirkit. Thinking that once Strykers fell, the whole world would realize he was wielding legendary-grade secrets. He was about to crown himself the undisputed king of the server. Snapping back to the heat of battle, Liu Yi tracked the enemy's lightning-fast approach. Despite his high-speed evasions, Strykers was already breathing down his neck. That's when Liu Yi leveled his muzzle and emptied the clip. The first round slammed into Strykers' chest, shattering his momentum and leaving the bot dazed. Without a moment's mercy, Liu Yi kept the hammer down, ruthlessly unloading lead into his opponent. Within seconds, Strykers was riddled with over 10 glowing bullet holes. Anyone else would have been deleted, but then the impossible happened. The copy stood there looking completely untouched and ready for a second round of carnage. With a dark grin, the enemy seemed to have seen through the trick. As he reloaded, strikers realized our hero's stats were a total anomaly. He was packing fatal state passives. That was the true nightmare of facing strikers. The Mirror Kingdom was a rigged game where the house always won. But Lu Yi was the ultimate glitch in the system, so he dropped into a low combat stance. With the blessing timer bleeding out, it was now or never. Determined to bury the enemy before his buff evaporated, Lu Yi went into a full-blown berserker offensive. With only 25 seconds of God mode left, failure was not an option he was willing to accept. He wasn't just fighting a bot. He was crushing his past failures and rewriting his destiny with his own hands. The clash intensified with every passing second. With only 15 seconds remaining, Lu Yi backflipped away and unleashed a counter-barrage. He parried and struck with zero room for error, choking the life out of Striker's movements. Just as the timer hit 0, he fired the final, decisive shot. The bullet found its mark right in the center of Striker's forehead, shattering the legendary armor. Strikers began to glitch and shake as his katana clattered to the floor. The light faded from his eyes, and a moment later, his strength completely evaporated. He collapsed, his HP bar finally hitting 0. The arena began to dissolve as Lu Yi stood over the fallen king, breathing hard. He had actually done it. He'd taken down the most invincible boss in the mirror world. He could already hear it. The absolute chaos his victory would cause. They'd have to call him the strongest player for slaying the level 30 nightmare. He was officially a broken, invincible warrior. A voice in his head whispered that to real level 30 players, these titles were just toys. They live in a realm of power he hadn't even touched yet. Compared to what was coming, a standard level 30 player was just dirt under his boots. They'd never be able to look him in the eye again. His ego hit the ceiling, fueling his spirit after the impossible win. Then, the rewards started flooding in. The first prompt celebrated his legendary win, while the second showed a mountain of gold and a massive explosion of experience points. He couldn't stop the grin spreading across his face. He was rich, leveled up, and had finally slain his inner demons. Then, he was warped back to the lobby. In the observation room, Jack stared at the screen, his brain failing to process how Lu Yi had crushed the strongest copy in the facility. But what really made his blood boil was the insane fortune he'd just lost by betting against the kid. Meanwhile, the two guys who bet on our MC were screaming like they'd just won the lottery. The white-haired boy gloated, saying he knew Lu Yi was the real deal. He told everyone to trust their gut, but his buddy grabbed him by the collar and told him to pipe down. He warned that they needed to log out and disappear in the real world before Jack's goons tracked them down. Back in reality, our protagonist was sitting on the edge of his bed, quietly soaking in the fact that he'd just conquered the game's toughest ghost. Suddenly, his door burst open. His sister popped in, figuring he was starving and inviting him to dinner. But he had a better idea. With a playful smirk, he told her to get ready because they were going out for a high-end barbecue feast. On the way down, she asked where the hell he got the money for luxury food. He just laughed and said he hit the jackpot, and it was time to celebrate. She didn't need any more convincing. The next day, back at the apartment, he finalized a massive online order. The confirmation said it would take 2 months to arrive. He leaned back, frustrated. In 24 days, the game would become the real world, and a 2-month wait was practically an eternity. But he was stuck because every local shop had been picked clean. Instead of moping, he steeled his resolve to grind even harder while waiting for his gear. The scene jumps forward to 2 girls walking along the beach, feeling the heat of everyone's stares. The best friend asked Yin why the heck Lu Yi had invited her out. She was half convinced he was about to deliver some terrible news. Lu Yin just kept smiling, secretly plotting to play matchmaker. Her friend was beautiful, rich, and kind, the perfect fiancé for her brother. If she pulled this off, her brother's future was set. Snapping out of it, Yin just said her brother missed her. Her friend, looking bored, asked where he'd been hiding since he wasn't even checking his work messages. Yin wondered for a second if her friend already had a man, but she didn't care. The date Lu Yi mission was still a go. Yin sighed, fixed her hat, and said it was a long story. Suddenly, the girl yelled that her parents were basically forcing her to play some crazy new online game. Yin was left blinking at the random outburst, totally lost for words. Meanwhile, the vibe shifts to a grimy local bar. Fuming with rage, Jack brutally backhanded a girl he'd brought over to cool his temper. It was a vicious strike. She hit the floor like a sack of bricks, fighting to stay awake. Jack didn't stop. He hated that pity in her eyes, feeling like she was mocking his loss, and he wasn't having any of it. A crowd gathered, sickened by the display, but nobody moved. Jack was a known psycho, and nobody wanted to be next. Feeling their eyes on him, he snapped, barking at them to mind their own business. Silence followed. Then, one by one, everyone cleared out, vanishing into the night to avoid the madman's wrath. Jack spat on the floor and pulled out his phone, still craving blood, hearing a voice call him friend on the other end. He demanded to know if they had tracked down the protagonist's home address yet. The answer was not yet, but they had a solid plan in motion. Jack listened, and once he heard it was a 100 lock, his face twisted into a demonic grin. He wasn't going to rest until Lu Yi paid in blood. With a voice dripping with venom, Jack promised to pay the rest of the bounty the second they found the kid. The line went dead, and we cut back to Lu Yi logging into the game. He stood outside the Mirror Kingdom, realizing that level 30 was the ceiling there. He'd outgrown the place. The enemies here were just fodder now. It was time to find a real challenge. He turned his back on the facility and started walking toward the destroyed realm, the land of true power. But as he caught his reflection, he realized he looked like a total noob in his starter gear. It was time for a shopping spree. Lu Yi hit up the high-end weapon shop. As he browsed the gear, a system window hovered in the air, displaying the stats and prices of the elite armor. But the moment he saw the price tags, he froze. His face turned pale. He was rich, but not by a small country rich, and the armor was insanely expensive. He walked away feeling like a total broke man. He exited the shop and aimlessly drifted through the Mirror Kingdom. It was clear that lingering there was a waste of time. High-tier crafting materials were non-existent in this zone. He set his sights on the destroyed realm, the perfect hunting ground to farm mats for his level 20 gear. Money wasn't the issue. He had the gold to buy level 20 gear outright, but he wasn't about to play his hand too early. With level 30 on the horizon, he had to balance his digital fortune with his real-world survival funds. Without looking back, he dove into the destroyed realm, hoping to snag a party to power level his way to elite status. Upon arrival, the plaza was a chaotic bazaar of parties recruiting for dungeon runs. Some were settling for level 20s, while the hardcore squads were strictly gatekeeping for level 30 elites to tackle the most suicidal high-tier raids. He hung back for a second, eavesdropping on a pair of players whispering about the New Order Guild. They were gossiping about a recent level 40 chaos dungeon run that turned into a bloodbath. 10 players wiped out, forced into a total status reset. Liu Ye understood the 4 ironclad rules of dungeon crawling, regardless of the squad size. Naturally, a bigger crowd meant a fatter payout, but there was one lethal catch. Once the portal closed behind you, the only way out was to clear every single floor. Worse yet, in Zhong World, a death in the destroyed realm meant your account was nuked to 0 and all your gear was stripped. This made party leaders insanely paranoid about who they let in. But with his broken hidden skills, Lu Yi figured he'd be the MVP of any team. Brimming with confidence, he approached. The first recruiter, only to be shut down instantly. This squad was strictly elites only, level 30 or bust. He tried his luck with another group, but they laughed him off, sneering at his low-tier, noob starter gear. On his third attempt, he didn't even get a word in. The party leader barked that they were full and didn't have room for any more deadweight. Frustrated and feeling the burn of rejection, he dropped to his knees. It was maddening. He'd literally pulverized strikers, a level 30 nightmare, yet no one would give him the time of day. He knew his raw combat power was off the charts, but these fools couldn't see past his level tag. For a fleeting second, he considered solo grinding the easy dungeons for scraps, but he knew there was a slow, agonizing crawl to the top. Still, he forced himself back up. He was just about to resign himself to the lonely grind when a heavy set of footsteps echoed behind him. A voice rang out. They needed one more body to fill their roster. Intrigued, Lu Yi spun around to see who was desperate enough to recruit a noob, not yet realizing they were looking specifically for him. Standing there was Jack, a predatory smirk plastered on his face. He invited Lu Yi to join a high-stakes expedition into a level 35 dungeon built for a 10-man execution squad. Locking eyes with Jack, Lu Yi's danger instincts started screaming. Something about this was way too convenient. Jack kept the sales pitch going, claiming his team was so cracked they could carry a mascot. They just needed a 10th person to trigger the raid gate. It seemed like a lucky break, but there was something hauntingly familiar about Jack's face, though the memory was just out of reach. Before he could overthink the trap, Jack shrugged, saying if he wasn't game, he'd find someone else in a heartbeat. Terrified of losing this shortcut to power, Lu Yi cut him off and accepted the invitation on the spot. Jack gave a sharp nod and signaled for him to fall in line. Together, they marched toward the entrance of the level 30 portal, the gateway for their 10-man raid. The assembly point near the destroyed realm portal was swarming with players. The crowd was decked out in gear that looked like it belonged to gods, and the whispers started immediately. Nobody could believe a top-tier leader was bringing along a level 1 trash character armed with nothing but a pea shooter. Lu Yi did a quick threat assessment of his new teammates, and his heart sank. These guys weren't just well-geared, they were absolute whales. More than half the squad was dripping in the purple glow of temporal rarity gear. He stroked his chin, his mind working a mile a minute. He started wondering if he might liberate some of that high-tier loot for himself later on. Suddenly, one of the elites roared that they were wasting daylight. He wanted to hit level 40 before the sun went down. Up by Tunk stepped up with a grin, joking that once they hit 40, they'd be dumping their current gear anyway, so maybe he'd donate his scraps to the group. The other players just cackled, unless someone was brave enough to wield his weapon with 3 rare gems, an offer that met total silence. The squad began their march into the portal while Lu Yi trailed behind, playing the role of the observant observer. He could tell these guys were a tight-knit unit and couldn't fathom why they'd pluck a stranger for a level 35 suicide mission. One look at their snake-like grins told him everything. The warm welcome was a total lie. Finally, the portal shimmered open, spitting them out into a vast, bone-dry wasteland. In the dead center of the map stood a single, pulsing, mysterious crystal. Jack and another vanguard were the first through, instantly fanning out to scout the perimeter. Moments later, a system ping echoed the objective. Guardian duty, protect the crystal. Jack took the reins immediately, barking orders for everyone to lock down a perimeter around the crystal and let nothing through. The squad moved like clockwork, but Lu Yi hesitated for a beat. Jack snapped at him, warning that if any monster even breathed on that crystal, the damage fee would be coming out of his real-world bank account. Lu Yi was internally impressed by their discipline, even if he kept his poker face on. He wasn't in any rush to jump into the meat grinder. He kept his eyes glued to the crystal. Then, without warning, a system alert flashed crimson in his vision. Raid starting. A heartbeat later, the next message appeared. The mission: hold the line against 3 waves of nightmare fuel. At the edge of his vision, he saw the crystal's durability bar and the failure condition, total party annihilation. A sudden scream shattered the silence. Someone bellowed that the monsters were closing in, and Lu Yi scanned the desert horizon, but saw nothing but a thick, suffocating wall of unnatural fog. It clicked instantly, this wasn't weather. The monsters were generating this fog as cover for their assault. A nightmare lunged from the smoke at blinding speed. A freakish spider thing with fangs the size of daggers. The bald tank barked at Lu Yi to hug the crystal, warning him he'd be the first to die if he strayed. Without a word, our hero fell back. Meanwhile, a swarm of hellish insects buzzed toward the bald man and his massive axe. It looked like he was about to get swamped, but the MC had his own cheat codes ready for this raid. With one brutal swing, the bald man turned a dozen beetles into green goo. Lu Yi watched the squad swatting these giant monsters like they were annoying houseflies. He had to admit, their synergy was surgical. Our protagonist realized this crew was far from amateur. He felt like the fifth wheel in this fight and decided to take it easy, figuring he'd only get in the way of their well-oiled machine. Jack was carving through the monsters with ease until he suddenly paused and shot a sharp, meaningful look at the swordsman nearby. With just that one glance from the leader, the swordsman got the message loud and clear. Let one slip through to the kid. Without a second thought, he intentionally left a gap in the defense for the first monster that lunged at him. Feigning a miss, he let the multi-legged freak slide right past his blade. It bolted straight for the protagonist, aiming to shatter the crystal. But the young man didn't even blink. With a cold smirk, he heard the others frantically screaming for him to save the crystal since a monster had broken through. It took him a mere few seconds to completely erase the creature from existence. In that moment, he realized that despite their flashy teamwork, their raw power was mediocre at best, nothing compared to the level 30 striker's ghost he'd already dismantled. The notification pinged. Wave 1 cleared. A 10-minute breather before the next nightmare. After sweeping up the trash mobs, the squad took a knee to recover their stamina. One of them noted that the kid was a dark horse. Looking at him, you'd never guess he was a killer, but dropping a mob 10 levels higher with starter gear was no small feat. The swordsman who missed started groveling, blaming himself for the slip-up. He whined that if their 10th regular hadn't gone MIA, the defense would have been airtight. The ball man waved it off, then turned to the MC with a grim warning. For the next wave, the free ride was over. He'd have to stand on the front lines and bleed with the rest of them. The player sitting near Liu Yi leaned in, suggesting they officially scout him into the party. He asked the MC if he wanted to sign on full-time, so he wouldn't have to beg for groups like a common noob. Besides, with a crew like them, they could steamroll the highest level raids in the game. The protagonist liked the sound of Shortcut and was almost tempted to say yes. A moment later, the guy in a black plate armor asked Jack for his verdict on the new blood. Jack grinned like a shark and said he was open to it, but there was a catch. All recruits had to cough up their real phone numbers and home addresses just in case someone tried to ninja the loot. Hearing that, the protagonist's internal alarm went off like a siren. He stayed stone-faced, listening as Jack started spinning a sob story about how hard they worked for their gear and how a traitor named Sam had ghosted them. If Liu Yi wanted the protection of the guild, he had to accept these security terms. The protagonist went dead silent. He didn't need a map to see exactly where this road was leading. After the pitch, Jack and his goons flashed grins that were so malicious it was comical. Liu Yi's suspicion turned into absolute certainty. They claimed they were just extending a hand, but for a few heartbeats. The air turned to ice. Liu Yi stood up and scanned these mid-tier predators, realizing this was a setup from day one. They'd scouted him, played nice, and accidentally let a monster through just to measure his threat level. Now, they were fishing for his real-world location. With a dry grin, Liu Yi realized this entire raid was just an elaborate sting operation to hunt him down in the real world. Staring into Jack's eyes, which were now leaking pure, killing intent, the protagonist didn't flinch. He casually mentioned that Jack was probably the high-ranking dog running the Mirror Realm for New Order. He mentioned overhearing that New Order had tracked down the home of a 20-year-old who beat strikers, and that poor kid was never heard from again. The young man smirked and said he was touched they went to all this trouble just for him, especially since he was the one who trashed their level 30 strikers. With that, the protagonist knew. Jack hadn't gathered this squad for a dungeon clear. They were here to squeeze his address out of him and then delete him from reality. Jack, desperately trying to maintain his mask, stammered that the kid must have him confused with some other villain. Weapon at the ready, the protagonist admitted he never gave a damn about their squad. He just wanted a quick injection of cash and XP. But since the masks were off, there was no point in playing nice. They were enemies, and he had a policy about enemies. He stood his ground, as Jack's face twisted into a demonic mask of pure hatred. As the 9 players closed in, Jack cackled, mocking the idea that a lone trash character could survive a 9 on 1 against players 10 levels higher than him. One of the goons lunged at his blind spot, screaming that he was about to become a memory. System alert. Liu Yi burned 30 power points to infuse his next strike with 1,500 bonus damage. Status: 414 power/450 cognition. In the blink of an eye, the attacker was deleted, his body sent flying meters away by the sheer impact of the blow. The squad went bone white. He just one-shot an elite 10 levels above him. The circle around him froze in terror. Nobody expected a noob to possess that kind of god-tier burst damage. Suddenly, the dead player's avatar began to pulse with a blinding blue light, as if his data was being harvested. After the glow faded, a mysterious orb hovered in the air, a blue military pearl. Note, these pearls are the ultimate loot, dropping from defeated players with a chance to steal their rarest gear or items. The protagonist snatched the orb out of the air and, with eyes as cold as a grave, asked, "So, who's next for the impossible 9 on 1? Jack, now absolutely livid, was ready to tear him limb from limb, convinced the kid was just riding a lucky streak. A moment later, Jack barked the order for a total swarm, trying to drown the protagonist in bodies. But unfortunately for them, our hero's mercy had just run out. Seconds later, the first girl in the squad was erased from the server. Just like the man he'd already put a hole through, the protagonist executed them one by one. He knew that by wiping these snakes out, he was deleting their only chance at survival. But honestly, he didn't have a choice. He couldn't afford a game over here. His sister's entire future rested on his shoulders, so no matter how much they begged for their lives, he had to reach a higher peak. With his current stats, he wouldn't stand a chance at protecting his sister once Zhong world fully merged with reality. Right then and there, the protagonist vowed to claw his way to the absolute top. But first, he had to prune the weeds that might trip him up later. To pave his way to glory, Liu Yi prepared to wade through the mountain of corpses piling up at his feet. Jack and his entire squad were paralyzed, frozen by the sight of their comrades falling. They couldn't fathom how their superior levels in high-tier gear were failing them so miserably. RMC, meanwhile, was just getting annoyed. Even though Jack had already pegged the protagonist as a monster for trashing a level 30 striker's copy, his goons tried to talk the MC down, claiming that if he killed any more of them, the dungeon raid would fail and everyone would lose their hard-earned loot. The protagonist coldly shot back that he didn't give a damn, since he could just cruise back to the mirror secret zone and do it all over. Any loss he took could be recovered in a single day. But for them, it was a death sentence. The team would be wiped out, and they were too weak to handle the Mirror Kingdom's elites on their own. Jack's rage boiled over, and he snarled a threat to gather a massive mob to blacklist the protagonist from ever stepping foot in the Mirror Secret Zone again. But Louis just laughed in his face. Then, he began a systematic massacre of Jack's allies, a display of dominance that Jack could barely wrap his head around. Jack opened his mouth to bark a retreat and save what was left of his crew. But before he could squeeze out a word, two more players behind him were already hitting the dirt as cold corpses. While his squad was being systematically dismantled, Jack flashed back to a meeting with a high-level VIP who told him they had to remain the kings of Zhong world at any cost. As long as they were on top, the VIP would cover for any dirty tricks. However, the VIP's voice turned cold as he added that if they failed, not only would the support vanish, but he would personally leak their crimes to the authorities, ensuring they rotted in a cell. When Jack snapped back to the present, he realized he was standing in a graveyard. Every single one of his men had been wiped out, leaving him the sole survivor. Liu Yi leveled his weapon to put Jack out of his misery. But the big boss Jack collapsed to his knees, pathetically groveling for his life. He desperately implored the protagonist to show a shred of mercy and spare him. The young man didn't say a word, just pierced him with a cold, soul-crushing stare that made Jack's blood boil. He felt so pathetic it made his own skin crawl with disgust. Hanging by a thread, Jack blurted out that he'd trade a deep secret about Zhong world for his life. Liu Yi smirked and told him to start talking before he changed his mind. Without stalling, Jack tried to force a promise out of the protagonist that he wouldn't be killed after the reveal. But a brutal blast sent him flying several meters. Liu Yi coldly remarked that if he didn't want to talk, he'd happily send him to the afterlife, as he wasn't that desperate for some dusty secret. Jack crashed into the sand a good distance away, but surprisingly, his body didn't shatter into loot pearls upon impact. He actually managed to survive the hit and try to scramble up with trembling limbs, which caught even the protagonist, Liu Yi, off guard. He was genuinely impressed by Jack's toughness, wondering how the hell he walked away from a direct hit. Suddenly, a low, rumbling noise echoed from the depths of the desert wasteland, and he immediately deduced that the second wave of the nightmare was about to crash down on them. To stall for time, Jack claimed Liu Yi must have already cracked some of Zhong world's secrets, or he never would have become this broken. What terrified Jack most was his own helplessness, so he planned to report this anomaly to the higher-ups. He warned that Liu Yi would soon have a target on his back much bigger than just one man. The protagonist was marked for death and a total level 1 reset. Staggering to his feet, Jack sneered, asking if the protagonist really thought he could defy those above him forever. It was an impossible dream, and once the secrets Liu Yi relied on became common knowledge, his cheat advantage would vanish. The man started begging again, offering to reveal his secret if the protagonist let him live. He even suggested they use Liu Ye's freakish strength to steamroll the rest of the dungeons together. Liu Yi just smiled and asked why Jack assumed he was going to die, or that he needed help to clear a few measly dungeons. Jack was floored by the MC's arrogance. After all, Liu Yi was only level 28, and even a monster has limits. At least, that's what Jack's small mind told him. But then the protagonist dropped a bombshell. If I'm rocking level 56 gear, don't you think a level 35 dungeon becomes a walk in the park? Jack's jaw hit the floor at Liu Ye's revelation. The protagonist held up 2 loot pearls and asked if this was the impossible gear Jack was talking about. Squinting, Jack recognized the blue orb in the man's hands and couldn't believe his eyes. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. With a smirk full of lethal intent, the protagonist commanded the blue orb to break and release its hidden treasures. In a flash of light, the protagonist was suddenly decked out in sleek, high-tech yellow and black armor. He was now wearing a frost sleeveless shirt, a purple-tier masterpiece that pumped out incredible buffs. He also equipped a rapid combat suit, a purple-tier powerhouse that encased his body, boosting his resistance, strength, agility, and defense. A suit that normally required level 30 just a touch. The combat gloves added to the pile, focusing heavily on perception while trading off a bit of raw strength. His feet were now fitted with violet-tier high-speed combat boots, giving the protagonist godlike agility. The centerpiece was the ace-like katana, a purple-tier blade that granted Liu Yi a massive plus 160 attack power and bumped his defense by 30. Now our hero's stats were through the roof. A quick combat power check revealed he was effectively a level 46 juggernaut. With a dark smirk, he mused that he owed a thank you to the losers he'd just slaughtered, since they basically gifted him top-tier gear for free. With this new loadout, his raw combat output had spiked more than threefold. It was the ultimate proof that his enemies were too incompetent to even use the power they held. Jack's face turned ghost white with terror. He couldn't process the fact that Liu Yi had just tripled his attributes in seconds. Moments later, the shock curdled into a foul mixture of pure rage and desperate hatred. He began screaming like a madman, barking that no matter how much gear the hero stole, clearing this dungeon solo was still a suicide mission. As if on cue, the desert air filled with the skittering sounds of thousands of monsters approaching at terrifying speeds. Then, the first of the swarm lunged straight for the crystal's heart. The hero began deleting anything that dared to get close without even blinking an eye. For every ant he crushed, 10 more surged from the sand. Hundreds of monstrous ants swarmed from the rear, desperate to tear him apart and reset his level to 0. But Liu Yi wasn't about to let his story end here. One by one, he butchered the ants, refusing to give them even a fraction of a second to find an opening. Liu Yi knew that if he faltered here, his sister's protection would vanish. Thanks to the pearl's overpowered effects, he didn't even need to use his brain to wipe out the insect swarm surrounding him. He stood his ground, a lone sentinel valiantly defending the crystal against a tide of enemies from every horizon. His life was on the line, and he was ready to seize this victory by any means necessary. He mowed down the ants in a continuous, lethal rhythm. The body count hit the ceiling, but the swarm felt like an endless ocean of chitin and fangs. When Liu Yi's health bar dipped dangerously into the red, he triggered a high-speed healing spell, keeping the slaughter going without missing a single beat. Meanwhile, Jack managed to scrape by killing a few stragglers. He noticed the protagonist was flagging, but to his horror, Liu Yi's health snapped back to full instantly. Jack was losing his mind, convinced Liu Yi was chugging rare potions, and screamed that it wouldn't save him. Jack figured if he just kept dodging, he could outlive the MC. Liu Yi didn't even acknowledge Jack's existence, focusing entirely on the sea of monsters. Jack kept howling that the MC would pay for his arrogance, but Liu Yi just smiled and told Jack to worry about his own skin. He had the monsters and the situation completely under control. Then Liu Yi coldly noted that even if Jack groveled or begged for his life now, it wouldn't change his fate. Those words pushed Jack over the edge. He couldn't believe that even in a hellish swarm like this, Liu Yi remained so unshakably confident. The sharp-eyed Jack spotted an ant trying to flank his blind spot. He crushed it instantly. Meanwhile, Liu Yi continued his masterclass in extermination, though his health. But like a glitch in the system, he popped his healing skill one more time, refusing to let fatigue slow his blade for even a second. Hours bled by as he butchered the ant tide. There was no fear in his eyes, only a growing wasteland of corpses, yet the swarm refused to stop its assault on the crystal. Jack watched the skyscraper of dead monsters from the sidelines, his brain short-circuiting. It seemed impossible for Liu Yi to have that many healing items. No player could carry enough to survive a trial this long. While Jack was busy staring at the mountain of bodies, he missed a monster flanking him. It clamped onto his arm and dealt a devastating blow, sending his HP into freefall. He scrambled to pop a healing potion, but when he opened his inventory, he realized with a shock that he was bone dry. Panic finally set in as the cold realization hit him. This was the end of the road. His health was at 0%, and the swarm was closing in from every angle. He was tapped out of strength and luck. The monsters began to tear into him, their fangs and claws ripping through his armor and flesh with relentless brutality. Even as he was being eaten alive, Jack's petty soul refused to accept that he was dying first while Lu Yi was still standing. But looking at our hero, he saw Lu Yi still dancing through the swarm, killing with ease. Jack cursed him, swearing he'd make the kid pay the second they met in the lobby. Our protagonist just kept watching the carnage with a smirk, seemingly fresh and full of energy. He was actually enjoying the thrill of the hunt. After all, this was the ultimate training ground for his combat skills. At that moment, Jack was deleted from the map and sent back to the lobby with his level reset to 1. A system notification pinged on the MC screen. Team status, 1 survivor. All conditions met. Payout for the dungeon clear, multiplied by 10x. After a grueling marathon of slaughtering insects, our hero finally dropped to 1 knee, gasping for air and drenched in sweat. An unbelievable sea of dead ants stretched out as far as the eye could see, all victims of his blade, and at last, the wave of terror finally broke. The insects stopped their charge, and looking at the mountain of carnage, he felt a wave of relief. He knew the bodies would depawn before the second wave hit. If they stayed, he wouldn't even be able to see the crystal he was supposed to protect. Not far off, he spotted a glittering golden orb. A golden orb was the holy grail of loot, allowing a player to snatch 3 random items from a dead rival's pack. Seeing it, Lu Yi scrambled to his feet with a grin. He couldn't believe his luck, finding a golden orb here. It seemed the mirror copy manager finally did him a solid before biting the dust. Approaching the treasure, the protagonist scooped it up and paused to think. He was dangerously low on cognitive power and only had 10 minutes to recover, which would only fill half his tank. It wasn't enough for the third and final wave. He realized he burned his sub-boss skills too early. Now his only move was to pray that the golden orb held the key to surviving the final onslaught. Speaking the command to unlock the prize. The system offered him a choice between gear and items. Lu Yi crunched the numbers, knowing his strength, agility, and armor were hovering near the 100-point cap. He gambled on getting gear to push those stats over the edge, so he locked in the equipment option. The system chimed, confirming the draw as the orb began to glow with intense light. He pulled a set of purple and gray amber gear that boosted agility by 10 and perception by 5. In that same heartbeat, a legendary ring dropped into his palm. The third prize was a purple-class pendulum pistol, a beast that granted plus 200 strength, plus 30 wisdom, and a built-in block skill, while tripling damage or stunning enemies on impact. It even had an auto-reload feature, though it needed a full minute to top off. Lu Yi stood frozen in a state of absolute disbelief, eyes glued to the screen. This was beyond legendary. He felt as if he'd cashed in an entire lifetime of luck, not only securing God-tier team buffs, but also evolving his primary weapon into an absolute monster. Glancing at his refreshed status window, the protagonist pinpointed a detail that would change the course of his journey. 4 of his fundamental attributes had officially shattered the 100-point ceiling. Adrenaline surged through him. This meant his combat efficiency had transcended to a realm most players could only dream of. Reflecting on the chaos, Lu Yi realized that if those backstabbing vipers hadn't tried to bury him, he'd never have reached this tier of dominance so rapidly. With a cocky smirk, he decided to thank them for serving as the perfect stepping stones for his ascension. Locked and loaded for the next slaughter, he knew his only remaining mission was to hunt down the top rankers currently perched at the game's peak. The scene shifts, panning over the city as it sleeps under a blanket of night. We find ourselves inside a cold respawn chamber, the place where losers are stitched back together. Jack was at the center of the room, head bowed in a pathetic display of shame before his superior. He reported that Lu Yi definitely possessed a cheat code secret, allowing his stats to spit in the face of game logic. Jack argued that a fair loss was impossible. He insisted to the boss that no matter how insane it sounded, a level 28 player soloing a level 35 destroyed realm dungeon was a glitch, something was rigged, or his squad wouldn't have been swept away like common trash. The boss, eyeing Jack with nothing but pure loathing, granted him one final chance to grind his levels back up. As for Lu Yi, the boss decided to personally oversee his deletion by deploying a specialized execution squad. Jack stammered his thanks for the mercy and swore on his life to redeem his reputation immediately. We warp back to reality at a cozy cafe, where Lu Yun was practically shouting at Nien because, apparently, Nien's entire family had become digital addicts overnight. Nien clarified they weren't just playing for the thrill. They were actually raking in serious cash, a revelation that left Lu Yun completely floored. Nien couldn't wrap her head around the hype, but her parents were forcing her into the daily grind alongside them. She was burnt out and desperate for an exit, but since she was stuck, she at least wanted to play by her own rules. Suddenly, the girl stood up, eyes sparking as she asked Lu Yun why they didn't all just game together at the house. She thought it would be a riot to tackle that math-heavy world with her brother. Lu Yun was momentarily stunned by the idea, mostly because she hadn't even secured a gaming rig for herself yet. But then the gears turned. This was the golden ticket to play matchmaker for Nien and her brother. If they were tethered together in-game, her plan would be a masterpiece. All she needed was a clever excuse to clear out and leave the two lovebirds alone. It was a flawless setup, so she urged him to head to her place right this second. Now we flash back to our hero, who was currently drowning in the third wave. He was carving through enemies like a hot blade through wax, leaving a trail of data dust. Louis had never tasted power this raw or addictive. Since slotting in the new gear, he felt as if every fiber of his being was undergoing a forced evolution, especially when he pushed his heart rate to the limit. The katana in his grip felt as weightless as a phantom limb. His movement speed had become a flickering blur of high-speed agility, and his vertical leap allowed him to skywalk far above the sea of chittering monsters below. In those fleeting seconds, he looked like a sovereign standing over a kingdom of insects, majestic and untouchable amidst the carnage. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught Liu Ye's predatory gaze. A creature crawled out that actually made him pause, but his eyes stayed locked on the target without so much as a blink. He decided to go all in, plummeting from the sky to obliterate an entire legion of ants with a single, earth-shattering impact. But the slaughter wasn't enough. He hungered for more dominion, more XP, and more game-breaking abilities. By grinding these ants into the dirt, he intended to reach the heights he used to only gaze at from the bottom of the food chain. Then, the very nightmare he'd spotted earlier pulled itself into the light, towering over the surrounding trash mobs. The level 35 spider boss had entered the chat. Without a hint of hesitation, the protagonist moved in for the kill. Suddenly, a cascade of system alerts flooded his vision. He was hailed for his legendary solo clear and showered with a massive XP bounty. 360,000 points, instantly boosted by a 10x multiplier. Produce. He earned the prestigious title Dungeon Defender. A hidden perk of this title. For every teammate who bites in the dungeon, the player's stats jump by 10. His stats were now ascending to God tier status. Sitting pretty at level 36, he possessed a mountain of XP and attributes, damage, defense, stamina, and the rest that were nothing short of terrifying. Upon crossing the level 30 threshold, his specialization tree bloomed. Option 1. Silence, a skill that chokes enemy abilities for 5 seconds. Option 2. Captivity, a crowd control nightmare that roots a target to the spot for 10 seconds. With the boss slain, Liu Yi took a seat, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over him. He could barely wrap his head around the fact that he'd soloed such a titan. He was amped. He'd transformed into a literal monster in a matter of hours. It was an evolution so rapid, even he found it hard to process. Now, we return to the physical world, to the protagonist's humble apartment. Unplugging from the VR cosmos and stepping back into his skin, Liu Yi wandered out onto the balcony to let the night air clear the digital static from his mind. He felt an immense surge of pride regarding his meteoric rise. He was just waiting for the green light to dive back in and power level his sister, ensuring she'd be safe in the coming chaos. Suddenly, Liu Yi heard the soft click of a lock and a knock on the door behind him. Walking back into the living room, he found his sister had returned, and she was hauling a brand new VR rig. She complained that finding one was a nightmare, but luckily her bestie Nien pulled some strings, even if the hardware seemed to be acting a bit glitchy. The girl skipped into the room, and a second figure followed closely in her shadow. Liu Yi was stunned. He couldn't believe his sister actually secured a Zhone World link so quickly. His shock melted into pure relief. Now he could personally act as her shield in-game. Liu Yun, wearing a Cheshire Cat grin, said that since. Nien was the MVP who scored them the rig. They owed her big time, which meant Nien would be crashing with them for a while. Nien offered a casual greeting, but Lu Yi, in character, stared at the VR rig as if it were a holy artifact from a lost civilization. It was breathtaking. However, Nien felt completely invisible and grew annoyed that he was more charmed by a cardboard box than her. Lu Yi snatched the package and started grilling them on how they even tracked one down. To him, the how was irrelevant. Only the now mattered. His sister pulled a face, irritated that her brother was ignoring the goddess in the room to play with his toys, even though she knew Nien was their new roommate. In that moment, Nien was taken aback to see how a simple piece of tech could make a man like Lu Yi glow with such pure joy. Now, we rewind the clock 24 hours to an unknown level 40 dungeon, a haunted forest bathed in the glow of a blood moon. A squad was huddling around a campfire, plotting how this level 40 clear would skyrocket them past the two-team. They were also singing the praises of a powerhouse girl who'd led them to a hidden village. This girl was an enforcer for the New Order Guild, and her squad was currently ranked 3rd globally. Her name was Wei Yi. Suddenly, a guy named Chao Yang slid over, suggesting she aim for the one team after this raid, so her power could truly explode. Confused, or perhaps just bored, she didn't seem to give a damn about his pitch and completely ghosted his advances. Then, one of the lackeys warned the captains that if Wei Yi jumped ship, their progress would hit a dead end. The captains tuned him out and started bickering about how the team had no future without her light. They'd sunk way too much into her to let her walk, especially when she was their ace in the hole. The captains sighed deeply, stating they couldn't chain a bird that wanted to fly. He believed she wouldn't forget her roots even after she became an elite in New Order. The captain decided to get a final answer and, with a forced smile, asked for her take. In response, he only caught a glimpse of Wei Yi's enigmatic, chilling smile. One member, clutching his head, realized he couldn't just play the nice guy and let her walk away so easily. Another member sided with the captain, admitting they were too weak and it was a crime to hold Wei Yi back from her true destiny. The group started a chorus of kindness, saying if the elite life got too tough, she'd always have a home here. They were acting like a real family. In response, she beamed and thanked them, calling them big brothers and saying they were far too kind to her. Since they were being so generous, she said she had one final favor to ask. As the words left her lips, she looked almost shy. The entire squad froze in a state of absolute shock, their brains failing to process her request. A graveyard silence swallowed the camp. Seconds later, a blinding explosion of light erupted. Every single member of the team was deleted instantly. The only survivor left clinging to life tried to spam a healing skill, staring in absolute horror at the betrayal. Wei Yi, who had been their little sister the whole time, had gutted them. She craved the summit, but her level was lagging, so she chose to sacrifice her family to trigger a massive hidden reward and become the queen of Zhong World. The captain was white with fury. After everything they'd given her, this was the thanks they got? Wei Yi just smirked and waved him off, telling him not to be such a sore loser because it's just a game, and they could always just respawn and start over. The captain had heard enough and lunged at the traitor with a curse on his lips, but Wei Yi effortlessly swatted his bullets out of the air. She mocked him, reminding him of the cardinal rule. In Zhong World, bullet velocity has a hard cap. Therefore, a gun is useless against a player with over 100 agility. With a cold, fluid motion, she spun around and drove her blade through the captain's throat. Wei Yi whispered that cold steel was the real king. Blade damage scales purely with the user, with no limits on speed. She ended him without a blink. The next day, we warped to a level 45 dungeon where 20 players are sieging a humanoid boss. The captain notes that several members are running bone dry on meds and asks if the supply run was a success. The captain, known as Strikers of the New Order Guild, was fighting with godlike power while the raid watched in awe. He was a master, but his strength had a catch. He needed a massive charge-up time to reach full throttle. But once he hit the red line, he could delete even the most colossal bosses without breaking a sweat. The captain was a formidable level 45, and at his side stood Blazing Fire, another level 45 heavy hitter and high ranker of New Order. During the heat of the raid, the captain sensed another player with a similar aura and immediately started calculating if this newcomer was a threat to be buried or a tool to be recruited. The strategist, Urgent Lay reported that this mystery player had already assassinated the captain of the Mirror Realm. This shocked Strikers so much he actually stopped to scratch his head in confusion. The captain then pivoted, asking about a girl named Wei E and what kind of trouble she was stirring up. The scene shifts to a haunting forest just outside the safe zone. A girl stands at the edge of a jagged cliff, scrolling through her system HUD. She just received a DM from Blazing Fire, telling her she needed to scout a new player, our hero, because his power levels were absolutely off the charts. Wei E flashed a dark, happy smile while reading the message, which curiously said nothing about whether she should recruit him or kill him. She was fully aware that high-tier elites were a rare breed. Snagging the protagonist for the guild would mean having a powerhouse at their beck and call. However, deleting him now would be like sabotaging their own future growth. The guild master couldn't care less about our hero's fate and tossed the final verdict to her, given her status as a top-tier asset. She had to flash her brilliance by bringing the protagonist into the fold. But after weighing her options, she decided she'd rather just end him. Meanwhile, back at the Liu residence, he was hunched over his desk, meticulously mapping out a tactical blueprint for the game world. His eyes were set on a dual goal, grinding his level and his gear to a solid level 60. In the real world, he had to construct a fortress before the apocalypse hit. He remembered clearly from his past life that level 60 was the ultimate ceiling for any player. If he could hit that max cap before the game and reality merged, he'd be the undisputed king of the new world. With that kind of godlike power, he could guarantee a safe haven for himself and his sister. When society crumbles and resources vanish, only the Titan guilds will hold any sway. In that bleak future, food will be the ultimate gold. Stockpiling rations and fortifying a safe house wasn't just a choice, it was survival. He burned through his remaining cash to rent out the neighboring building, dumping every last cent into a mountain of rice and canned supplies. With the order placed, all he could do was play the waiting game for his stash to arrive. Back in the digital realm, he was stuck at level 36, still miles away from his ultimate objective. To reach the peak, he had to keep his head down, stay alive, and keep hoarding. That was the only way he and his sister could find peace once the game swallowed the world. Leading his sister and her friend into the game, he marched them straight to the weapon pavilion. He broke it down for them. In Zhone World, power is everything, and it starts with a blade. To truly evolve, they had to master every weapon type to unlock their hidden potential. As his sister weighed a spear in her hand, he gave Nian Chu a reality check. Flashy skills are garbage without ki, so training was the only path forward. They had to bleed and sweat with every weapon until they reached the pinnacle of mastery. Currently, Nian Chu was sitting at level 32. The two girls nodded, fully committed to the grind. Liu Yi headed for the exit, glancing back at them and realizing his every move was already rewriting the script of history. In his previous life, Nian Chu had never even stepped foot in his house. He wondered if his meddling was the reason she'd brought the VR rig to Liu Yun this time around. Back then, it was Nian Chu who kept him and his sister alive for 3 long years. Now, he felt the weight of the debt. It was his turn to be her guardian. Fueled by that resolve, he bolted out of the pavilion, his heart racing as the dream of level 60 felt within reach. After a grueling half-day in a level 35 dungeon, Liu Yi emerged as a level 37 powerhouse. One of his squad mates flashed a toothy grin, awestruck by his freakish strength, noting he could solo 10-man raids like a walk in the park. Another teammate chimed in, admitting they would have been toast without him. The group was buzzing, desperate for another round of dungeon crawling, but Liu Yi shut them down. He had much bigger fish to fry. The rejected players begged him for a friend invite, promising to be at his beck and call for the next raid. He gave a small smile, scratched his head, and hit accept. However, standing in the Party Finder hall, his heart began to race with anxiety. Clearing a 10-man level 35 raid ate up half a day for just a measly half level. At this snail's pace, he'd only hit level 50 before the world burned. Level 60 was starting to look like a pipe dream. Brooding alone in the silent hall, he thought back to his first clear. That was when he'd snagged the dungeon protector title. And the dark truth hit him. There was a shortcut. By sacrificing all 9 teammates, he could hoard the entire XP pool for himself. In his past life, these runs were called slaughterhouses, and the players who ran them were branded as street rats. If he took that path, he'd be the ultimate villain. But if that was the only way to save what mattered, His dark train of thought was shattered by a sudden ping. A system window hovered before him with a fresh message. Popping it open, he found an invitation to a high-stakes dungeon. It was a level 40 expedition designed for a 10-man elite squad. When his eyes hit the sender's name, his heart nearly stopped. The shock was instantly replaced by a wave of pure, electric excitement. He practically levitated, realizing this was the girl who became the absolute strongest warrior in his past life. Louis wondered why a legend like her was reaching out to him. If he took the bait, he'd be on a fast track to evolution at breakneck speed. A sharp, confident smirk played on his lips. She was a heavy hitter from New Order. Since they'd never met like this before, he was 100% sure she was baiting a trap for him. His legs felt heavy for a split second, but his gaze was cold and steady. This dungeon was his only ladder to the top. With a final breath, he tapped the screen. Invite accepted. The roster loaded up. Every single player was a monster ranging from level 37 to 45. Scanning the names, Louis' smile widened when he saw the infamous Lien Fei. He remembered the legend. Lien Fei had once triggered a desperate situation reward by being the last man standing after his entire team was mysteriously wiped out. The global chat had been on fire with hate for weeks. Then there was the girl known as Cookie. She started as a simple troll, but ended up self-defending her entire squad into the grave. Every member on the list had a similar blood-stained record. This wasn't a team. It was a wolf pack handpicked by Wei Yi. Louis stroked his chin, intrigued. He wondered how Wei Yi had managed to scout every single problem child for this specific run. Once he joined the lobby, the chat went live. He told them to quit stalling and move out. Wei Yi dropped a map pin for the rendezvous. Lien Fei, eyeing the newcomer, was skeptical, questioning if he was truly the one since he was only level 37. Wei Yi shot back that in this circle, levels are just numbers. Only lethal intent matters. Louis checked the map and saw most were in Muksu City, while the rest were already pushing into the out-of-control zone. His expression turned grim as he scanned the map. That zone was a literal graveyard. Muksu City's territory was split into 5 distinct sectors. The city itself was the only safe harbor for supplies. The dungeons within the walls were tamed and heavily modified for training beginners or minor challenges. The control danger zone was a bit more intense, but still safe-ish since all the monsters were sealed. He toured one of those with Chicken Crown. But the chaos zone, that was where things got bloody. The city had zero leverage there. Level 30-plus monsters roamed the open world like they owned it. The out-of-control zone was a level deeper into hell. Entry was basically a death sentence, with level 70-plus behemoths stalking the shadows. And finally, the destruction zone. Total anarchy. Muksu City had no eyes there. Monsters couldn't be sealed, and max-level titans were capable of erasing entire guilds from existence. After a long trek, Louis finally reached the fringes of the out-of-control zone, nearing the meetup. He was sprinting through the dense foliage when suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air. He spun on his heel, desperately trying to pinpoint the source of the cry. In an instant, freakish monsters made of twisted roots and leaves lunged into the clearing. Reacting instantly, he dove behind a jagged rock, watching as the 4 stalkers sprinted toward the nearby stream, their vine-like limbs trailing behind them like whips. He realized they were weak on their own, but they were a hive mind. One wrong sound, and you'd be buried under a tidal wave of green. That scream had to be from some rookie player who just signed their own death warrant. Silence eventually reclaimed the woods. Louis peeked out and saw the coast was clear. He seriously doubted the screamer was still in one piece. He bounded from his hiding spot, knowing he couldn't afford to waste another second. He pushed toward the rendezvous point, but his sixth sense caught a flicker of movement in his periphery. A spear tip whistled through the air toward his throat. He parried the strike in a blur of motion, leaning back as the steel grazed him. The attacker pressed the assault, and Louis strained to get a look at his mysterious assailant. The shadow gripped the spear with white knuckles, launching another lethal thrust. But Louis danced around strike. Now, he was locked eye to eye with his opponent. The stranger's eyes were practically glowing with battle-hungry excitement. Louis unsheathed his katana and launched a counterstrike. The enemy held the spear with both hands, catching the blade on the shaft. Then, a wild grin spread across the attacker's face. The clash generated a thunderous boom, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and dead leaves. After a tense silence, they stood frozen, measuring each other's killing intent. Lin Fei, the man who'd just jumped him, looked thoroughly impressed. He finally understood why the captain had scouted this level 37 rookie. Lu Yi kept his guard up, frowning, until Lin Fei, still beaming, admitted he was outclassed, but felt he'd at least tested the waters enough to give Lu Yi some respect. Before taking off, he warned that they had to hit the meeting point fast, or the forest would swallow them whole. With that, he vanished into the brush without a backward glance. Only then did Lu Yi sheathe his blade, watching the spot where Lin Fei had disappeared. He knew he'd just met a true apex predator, and if the subordinate was this fast, he had to be a total monster. This team was stacked with terrifying potential. It was anyone's guess who would snag the desperate situation reward, but one thing was certain. The body count in this dungeon would be high. However, eventually, he pulled up to the rendezvous where the rest of the pack was already waiting. Approaching the glowing portal, he slowed down, spotting a girl perched casually on a nearby boulder. She gave him a knowing smile and hopped down to her feet. She commanded the room by clapping her hands, announcing she had a few things to say before they dove into hell. Our protagonist scanned the faces of his new squad, realizing he was now a wolf among wolves, even if he still felt like a bit of an outsider. The captain took center stage, explaining that dungeons in this zone were total wild cards. Her first rule, figure out the game's logic, no matter how insane it seems. She demanded they stay cool and use their heads. That was the only way they were all walking out alive. The players nodded in silent agreement, and with an approving smirk, she led them toward the swirling portal, declaring it was time to move out. As the others stepped into the light, our hero lingered for a heartbeat. The shadow of doubt flickered in his mind as he reflected on the heavy feeling in his gut, realizing that ever since meeting Wei Yi, the undisputed queen of the game, he'd started to question his own worth. He couldn't tell if it was just nerves or the fear that he'd never actually catch up to them. He was terrified that one wrong move would send all his hard work up in smoke. But rather than letting that paralyzing doubt swallow him whole, he looked toward the sky, where the moon cast a haunting glow over the silent forest. Steeling his nerves with a heavy breath, he surged forward, ready to scream his worth to the world the very second he stepped through the portal. Suddenly, nightmarish visions flickered across their screens, weaving the dungeon's dark lore. A doll wept, lamenting that her favorite playmate had grown tired of their games. There, slumped against the cold stone in a deep coma, was the woman who once shared her laughter. Cold as ice, the doll declared that if this toy was broken, she'd simply have to find a fresh one to play with. In a heartbeat, the scenery shifted into a grisly corridor choked with lifeless corpses. The architect of this massacre, a tiny, blood-splattered mechanical doll, sighed with boredom, reminiscing about the fun he had with his previous partner. Now, stranded in the silence, he whispered a desire to return home, only to bow his head in a hollow realization that the path back was forever barred. The cinematic faded, dropping the squad onto the cold, windswept summit of a massive circular tower. In the dead center, perched upon a grim pedestal, sat that very same blood-drenched doll. Carved into the base were the chilling words, "Hope and despair coexist." As the team stood frozen, one player stammered, questioning what kind of twisted hellscape they had stumbled into. Another member nodded in grim agreement, noting that this raid felt fundamentally different from any standard dungeon they'd ever encountered. Backing away from the portal's edge, one veteran remarked that the sheer randomness of these maps is what makes the meta world both a nightmare and a masterpiece. Another chimed in, his voice trembling as he noted the most terrifying truth. Some dungeons are designed as one-way trips where your life is the entrance fee. Fixating on the pedestal, the group surmised that the doll was the only interactive element, making it the clear catalyst for the trial. But then, in the blink of an eye, the doll vanished into thin air. A system alert blared across their HUDs. The exit had been sealed tight. The only way out? Surmounting the quest puppet's gambit. The objective was a ruthless game of tag. Destroy the doll. A puppet would be planted in one player's inventory, marking them for death by their own allies. To clear the floor, the owner had to survive for 6 agonizing hours. If the clock hit 0 first, it was game over for everyone. The twist: an owner could forcibly pass the puppet to someone else by executing an ally. Reading the fine print, our protagonist's heart skipped a beat. It clicked instantly, this dungeon. was a tailor-made slaughterhouse for those hunting the legendary desperate situation rewards. The rules essentially guaranteed that if a player stood as the lone survivor while holding the puppet, the ultimate prize would be theirs with 100% certainty. The system chimed, the puppet had been assigned, and the lethal countdown was live. Liu Ye. Mid-action, he froze, pulling back as a thought hit him. Showing his hand now would be a rookie mistake. He knew he had to play it cool until the initial panic subsided before checking his pack. If he truly was the chosen one, he'd have to decide whether to surrender the doll or fight the world. Handing it over would paint a massive bullseye on his back, and facing off against two elite high rankers was a fast track to a level 1 reset. The air turned frigid as the players began casting sideways glances of pure suspicion at one another, wrapping the entire tower in a suffocating shroud of tension. Liu Ye could see it in their eyes. Everyone was measuring the distance to the throat of the person standing next to them. They were all playing the same high-stakes poker game as him. That was when Wei Yi shattered the silence, clapping her hands to draw the eyes of her predatory squad. Liu Yi locked his gaze onto her, sensing the trap. With a razor-sharp smirk, Wei Yi suggested that for the good of the group, the puppet's owner should just volunteer for a painless execution. She promised the final loot would be split evenly among the survivors and asked the non-owners to back her play. One by one, the other players voiced their support for her fair execution plan. Sensing everyone's attention was glued to Wei Yi's speech, Liu Yi seized his window. He flicked his system window open and scanned his inventory with bated breath. His blood ran cold, and his pupils dilated in shock when he saw that cursed mechanical doll sitting right there in his backpack. He cursed his luck. He'd barely stepped foot in this squad, and they'd already gifted him a death sentence. He gritted his teeth, double-checking the inventory slot before, slowly scanning the room. His priority had shifted from defense to offense. He needed to drop a teammate immediately to pawn this puppet off on someone else. He had to neutralize the most immediate threat, but he was still weighing which head to take first. Even if he dumped the doll, he knew these two elites would never let a potential rival walk away alive. Before anyone could even breathe, one of the players barked out, demanding to know who was going to confess first. Liu Yi kept his head down, maintaining a mask of perfect silence. But his stealth was shattered when the team captain marched over, looming over him with an overbearing presence. Flashing a shark-like grin, the captain told him the game was up. It was time to admit he was the one holding the puppet. Liu Yi was momentarily jolted by the direct call-out, but his pro-gamer instincts took over, his face hardening into a stone mask as he analyzed the situation. Another female player sneered his name, accusing him of always craving the spotlight and demanding he start talking. Liu Yi, true to his nature, remained as unmovable as a statue. He swept his gaze across the rest of the team once more, noticing that every single one of them was wearing the same twisted, knowing smirk. The way they were looking at him triggered a massive red flag. Piece by piece, the puzzle started to fit together. He realized they didn't need to read his face. They had a foolproof method to confirm he was the one carrying the curse. This wasn't a team. It was a coordinated lynch mob. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt, and Liu Yi couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. It was all a farce. The lucky invitation to this elite squad was just an elaborate setup to lure him into a grave. Even if he didn't know why this woman wanted him dead, it was clear this dungeon was his planned execution site. The sheer number of elites present was the final proof. He shot the female player a predatory look, concluding that by dragging him into this desperate situation, she'd actually just signed her own death warrant. After all, only one person was walking away with that reward, and it was going to be him. His grin widened as he finally embraced the twisted game they were trying to force him into. The woman merely scoffed, calling him ill-mannered, but admitting his strength was respectable. Still, she maintained he was a mere fly compared to the rest of the veterans. They were done playing house. The sooner he died, the sooner they could claim the spoils. Liu Yi simply nodded in chilling agreement. That's when Lian Fei roared with laughter, telling Liu Yi to give them a good show before he died. They wanted to savor the hunt, crushing his spirit before they crushed his throat. Wei Yi played along, hiding her face in her hands and whimpering about how cruel the boys were being. But when she dropped her hands, her eyes were sharp as daggers, and her smile was purely lethal. She whispered that he shouldn't have made them do this. Without a heartbeat of delay, Liu Yi flicked his gear to the pendulum and leveled the barrel straight at her heart. But he held his fire for just a fraction of a second. He watched his every move, figuring he was too scared to pull the trigger. She mocked him internally, thinking he didn't even realize he was being granted a merciful death. The rest of the squad jeered at the sight of his weapon, tossing insults like confetti. To them, he was a brainless rookie. A fool who draws first without a plan is just a corpse that hasn't fallen yet. Lien Fei smirked, wondering if the rumors about Liu Ye's special skill were true. Maybe he had some trick shot up his sleeve. The others laughed it off, boasting about their meta-knowledge. Magic pressure was an old-school trick, they claimed. One ally suggested they finish it quickly, warning that in the meta, you can forge cages out of thin air. He let out a melodic laugh, clearly relishing every second of the drama. Liu Ye's lips curled into a sinister smile as he whispered one word: capture. Wei Yi's laughter died in her throat instantly. She backflipped away, putting several meters of distance between them in a blur of movement. She frantically checked her status bar, and seeing she was untouched, tried to swallow the sudden lump of nerves in her throat. A shiver raced down her spine as she barked at Lien Fei, telling him to stop playing with his food. She realized the kid was dangerous, and they needed to swarm him now if they wanted to survive the night. Meanwhile, Liu Ye's smile only grew, savoring the sight of Lien Fei perfectly snared within his cage. The trapped warrior thrashed against his bonds, but the ethereal chains held fast, glowing with malevolent light. The rest of the team stood shell-shocked, their arrogant jeers turning into gasps of pure disbelief. Even Wei Yi could only stare at her immobilized partner, her mind reeling at the impossible scene. That was the moment Liu Yi activated his pistol's ultimate trump card, Lock Up. The skill gave him a binary choice: triple the raw damage or deliver a guaranteed stun. He chose the path of pure destruction, dumping 100 cognition points to supercharge the shot. His next hit was primed for a staggering 5,000 damage, with eyes burning like twin suns. He leveled his weapon and took aim right between Lien Fei's eyes. He pulled the trigger without a flicker of doubt. The bullet tore through the air with a sonic boom, shrieking toward the defenseless target. The projectile shredded through Lien Fei's chest, leaving a gaping, smoking crater where his torso used to be. His health bar vanished instantly, and he crumpled to the stone floor like a marionette with cut strings. System: Liu Yi has slain Lien Fei. The puppet has been forcibly transferred to a new host. The Dungeon Defender title surged to life, boosting Liu Yi's stats by 10 in honor of the fallen. To top it off, a loot pearl materialized over the corpse. The remaining squad members could only stare at their fallen ace, completely paralyzed by the sheer speed of the execution. Liu Yi analyzed the battlefield, knowing two main threats could still end him. First, a coordinated pincer attack from both Wei Yi and Lien Fei. Second, and more chilling, the possibility of a hidden fourth player lurking with some unknown, broken power. But looking at the wreckage, he realized only the original duo were true threats. By taking out Lien Fei first, he'd shattered their greatest advantage. They had lost because they were too arrogant to see the wolf in their midst. He let a cold smile crawl across his face. The balance of power had shifted, and victory was finally within arm's reach. He realized he now held the winning hand in this blood-soaked game. While dropping Wei, he would have been the ultimate play. Her freakish perception had allowed her to sense the danger and dodge by a hair's breadth. She was built for high-speed evasion. Liu Yi turned to the remaining survivors and gave them a chilling update. The puppet was now in one of their pockets. He dared them to move. If they tried to play hero, he'd simply delete the owner and end their revenge before it started. He knew he had to play this next phase perfectly to claim the final jackpot. His new mission? Find the new owner and make sure they lived or died, exactly when he decided. The team captain let out a string of curses, her body stiffening as pure terror took root. Sensing the Reaper's breath on her neck, she spun around and screamed at her group to stay absolutely still. She knew Liu Yi was hunting the new puppet owner like a predator. In their panic, the remaining goons huddled together in a desperate circle, trying to shield one of their own. The player in the center, shaking with primal fear, instinctively tried to shrink away from the group. Liu Yi's eyes locked onto her movement, and his smile turned predatory. He had found his mark. The sheer terror in her eyes was all the confirmation he needed. She was cornered, and her protectors were just more XP waiting to be harvested. Without a second's delay, he exploded forward, activating his ultimate buff, sending his stats skyrocketing by a massive 200. He became a blur of steel and death, headed straight for the puppet owner and ready to shred anyone foolish enough to stand in his path. Katana unsheathed, he tore through the battlefield, his blade singing as it carved through bone and armor alike. Their pathetic attempts at resistance were like trying to stop a hurricane with a paper shield. The system notifications began to scream. 6 more kills confirmed. His Dungeon Defender buff was now at 70, pushing his core attributes past the legendary 1,000 point mark. As he stood amidst the wreckage, showering in loot and new pearls, the real hunt was just beginning. Wei Yi lunged forward, fueled by a blind, murderous rage, white-knuckling her dagger as she tried to close the distance. Lu Yi, however, didn't break a sweat, reacting with reflexes that bordered on precognition. He deflected the lethal strike with a casual, precise flick of his wrist. Meanwhile, the player known as Cookie was a total mess, trembling so hard he collapsed to the floor, paralyzed by pure terror. The team captain, realizing the situation, shrieked that Cookie was still in the game and holding the puppet. It meant Lu Yi was going for the ultimate jackpot clear. Disgusted by his sheer audacity, she let out a venomous sneer. But Lu Yi didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply. He just offered a mocking smirk. Suddenly, her boots erupted in light as she triggered Arcane Leap, zipping across the battlefield like a glitch in the system. She barked a warning to her arrogant adversary, claiming he'd signed his own death warrant by making her his target. Moving so fast she became a literal blur, she began to circle him like a shark. Lu Yi stayed hyper-focused, but in a flash, she had completely vanished from his line of sight. Before he could even blink, Wei materialized directly behind him, her blade ready to taste blood. Expecting the backstab, he spun like a cyclone, swinging his katana in a wide, lethal arc. Wei Yi was one step ahead. She danced around the blade and surfaced at his rear again, burying a heavy punch in his back. Without letting him catch his breath, she unleashed a relentless, high-speed barrage of strikes. Every hit sent Lu Yi's health bar spiraling toward 0. But then, he popped his recovery skill, and in an instant his life bar snapped back to 100 as if the damage never happened. He then loomed over his opponent, raising his blade for a counter-crush. A panicked Wei Yi realized she just dealt 9,000 damage, 75 of his total HP, yet he was still standing. She finally understood she was fighting an unnaturally tanky monster. The sound of their clashing steel rang out like a thunderclap, echoing through the tower. Still confident, Wei Yi taunted that he'd burned through a stash of healing potions long before she tired out. Lu Yi, however, just kept that chilling, unshakable smile on his face. Wei Yi swapped her loadout and executed a sudden, explosive burst attack. The impact was brutal, shaving off 9,800 HP. Yet like a broken record, Lu Yi's health filled back up in the blink of an eye. Stunned, Wei Yi's mind began to race. A standard level 30 potion only heals 1,000 HP, and the inventory cap is 10 flasks. Lu Yi had already regenerated over 19,000 points. The math simply wasn't adding up. As she struggled to process his cheat, she missed Lu Yi's sudden lunge. He drove a powerhouse punch into her gut with the force of a falling star. Then, with a taunting grin, he offered a fake apology. Liu Ye declared with absolute certainty that he would be the last one standing when the dust settled. Wei Yi gritted her teeth and burned her stamina to dodge just as he launched another devastating assault. He watched her retreat with a look of pure boredom, unimpressed by her frantic scramble. Sliding to a halt right next to Cookie, she finally voiced her theory. With a health pool that massive, she was convinced he was hiding some high-tier support passives. Lu Yi smirked at her deduction, noting that Wei Yi had clearly dumped every single stat point into dexterity. Her speed was god-tier and her crit rate was cracked, but she was a glass cannon. For a fleeting moment, his eyes turned as cold as the grave. Then he forced a patronizing smile, pointing out that because of her lopsided build, her cognition power was bone dry. She was running on empty. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was backed into a corner with nowhere to run. Maybe her best move wasn't winning, but making sure he lost by killing Cookie and ending the game right now. Lu Yi immediately shifted into high gear. He realized he'd flexed a bit too hard, pushing her toward a scorched earth strategy. Wei Yi was a speed demon. She could delete Cookie 100 times before he could intervene. But if she knew she couldn't win, why the hesitation? Her logic was starting to crumble. Louis narrowed his eyes and asked her what exactly she was waiting for. As long as Cookie was breathing, his victory wasn't secured yet. Suddenly, a system ping echoed. The all-stats buff was maxed out. Even better, his pendulum and captivity skills were finally off cooldown. His eyes lit up, and without wasting a millisecond, he leveled his weapon at way E, ready to end it. But then, his body suddenly locked up, frozen mid-motion. What the hell is this? He thought, panic finally flaring. Before he could break the stun, Cookie lunged forward and delivered a fatal, silent blow to his own team captain. Wei Yi looked back at Liu Yi, her face twisted into a smug, triumphant victory grin. The trap was finally sprung. Wei Yi had ordered Cookie to kill her, and then himself, effectively deleting the owner and the participants to crash the dungeon. She promised him a double payout if he sabotaged the MC's clear, and the coward followed through perfectly. After stabbing her, Cookie turned the blade on himself. Both of their avatars began to shatter into digital pixels, fading into the void. Liu Yi stood there, paralyzed and shell-shocked by the sheer pettiness of it all. It was an absolute circus. Wei Yi's mocking laughter echoed one last time as she vanished, calling him a loser and gloating that he'd officially failed the quest. When the data finally cleared, Liu Yi was the only soul left in the hollow dungeon. He took a stumbling step back, his mind a hazy fog of disbelief. His legs finally gave out, and he hit the floor hard. His brain was screaming for answers. How? Why? But when he checked his inventory, the puppet had respawned in his bag. The realization hit him like a freight train. The entire battle was a wash. He couldn't believe Wei Yi would throw away her own progress just to spite him. It was the peak of absurdity. He clutched his hair in total despair, desperate for a way out. His targets were dead, the puppet was stuck to him, and the quest was in limbo. If he just finished her, he'd be rich. Now, he was just a lone ghost waiting for his own death clock to run out. The chance to rewrite his destiny had slipped through his fingers. He was supposed to win. A raw, desperate scream of frustration tore through the silent halls of the dungeon. After a long silence, his breathing finally slowed. He lay sprawled on the stone floor, staring blankly at the vaulted ceiling, trying to find his center. He whispered to himself that there had to be a secret ending or a hidden path. Zhong World didn't build dungeons for dead ends. If his allies were gone, there had to be a hidden mechanic to bypass the failure condition. He scrambled to his feet, scanning every inch of the room and weighing every insane possibility. He decided to hunt through the massive hall, determined to find a way out of this cage. Reaching the very edge of the platform, Liu Yi reached out and felt his hand press against a cold, invisible wall. He quickly identified it as a high-tier transparent barrier. Analyzing the boundaries, he realized the quest zone was locked to this one cylindrical stage. After a meticulous scan, he marched back to the central pedestal, his eyes narrowed. Clutching the doll, he stepped onto the stone platform and stood perfectly still, on high alert. He scrutinized every crack and carving until his gaze locked onto an engraved plaque with that haunting riddle. Hope and despair exist together. Leaning in, he noticed a tiny, faint scratch just beneath the main text. He realized there was a message hidden in microscopic script. Running his fingertips over the cold stone, he managed to decode the secret message. I cannot open the door. The moment he pressed the inscription, the slab shifted. The heavy, metallic thud of an ancient mechanism echoed through the chamber. Suddenly, a system alert flashed. Hidden path found. Entrance to the Cutscene Research Institute. But there was a catch. Opening the membrane required a staggering 1,000 cognition points. Liu Yi winced at the price tag. It was a king's ransom, especially with his energy tanked from the fight. Even with 1,500 strength, he was hovering just over the 1,000 point mark. He was in an all-or-nothing situation. He calculated the risk. By spending 700 points to pump his skills by 350, he'd stabilize his stats to meet the threshold. He'd be left with a measly 300 points for whatever was on the other side. It was a gamble, but he had to be ready for a fight. He locked in the choice, and the system surged. His skills spiked by 350 points as 700 cognition points vanished into the void. The final 1,000 points were siphoned off to dissolve the membrane. In an instant, the solid pedestal before him warped and twisted into a glowing doorway. A freezing, violent gust of wind slammed into him from the opening. Out of the darkness, a man's voice barked his name. It was urgent, demanding a split-second decision. The voice offered two paths: show what follows or dissolve and map everything. Liu Yi blinked, his mind reeling as he tried to decode the choice. The man roared for him to choose now, warning that his computing power was about to time out. Feeling completely blindsided, Liu Yi desperately tried to find the hidden logic in the prompt. What were the stakes? What would happen if he picked the wrong door? He took a breath and analyzed the bigger picture. If this was a hidden system test, then the world was likely teetering on the edge of a total collapse. Everything hinged on the phrase computing power. Was showing that power his shield, or was it the key to stopping the coming apocalypse? Thinking back to his past life, he realized he'd never even heard of a choice this high level before. If he wanted to guarantee his sister's safety, show what follows seemed like the path of strength. But if mapping the system was the only way to prevent disaster, dissolve and map everything was the strategic move. He knew that if the end was coming, he needed to be the one holding the map. He suspected that mapping power was linked to weeding out the weak. In the end, he decided the forgotten ones needed a chance. After all, the imagination attribute was the rarest of them all. Without the first world's emergence, the current level of player evolution would be impossible. Convinced this was the path to the ultimate truth, Liu Yi firmly chose dissolve and map everything. The moment he locked it in, a kaleidoscope of sparks exploded in his vision. He held his breath, waiting for the world to change. But as the blinding light faded, he looked down and realized he was standing in the exact same spot. He stood like a statue for several seconds before finally scowling and looking around. Nothing had happened, or so it seemed. The conclusion was inescapable. He had gambled on the wrong choice and lost. Liu Yi slumped down, crossing his arms over his chest as he agonized over whether show what follows was the true path. He was down to his last 350 cognition points. With that cursed puppet clinging to him like a digital parasite, he was stuck in a state of perpetual combat, slowing his energy regging to a crawl. Still, if he could hold out for 5 more hours, he could scrape together another 1,000 points and take 2 more shots at the puzzle. He just had to play the waiting game. He closed his eyes, steadying his breathing as he prepared to rot in the silence. An hour and a half later, a chime rang out. He had finally pulled 700 cognition points. His eyes snapped open, forcing his recovery rate to hit the red line as he burned through 1,000. Precious points to tear open the dimensional membrane once again. The same binary riddle flickered before him. Focus on showing what follows or dissolve and map everything. Liu Yi's finger hovered over the first option, but he yanked it back at the very last millisecond. If this was just a simple 50-50 coin toss, why hadn't the Research Institute opened up after he picked the wrong answer the first time? If this door was a filter meant to block the puppet, he'd never be able to enter the place he called home while carrying this cursed baggage. Something didn't smell right. Was it a hidden knowledge requirement or a specific stat check? Legend said the puppet fled the Institute in a fit of spite and now yearned to return, but the gate was barred. Maybe the answer wasn't the choice itself, but the sheer willpower behind it. Liu Yi narrowed his eyes, chewing over this dangerous theory. After running a million simulations in his head, he decided to bet it all on his hunter's instinct and chose the second option once again. Flash. He was unceremoniously dumped back onto the platform. 0 change. Now, he was down to his final life. If he choked now, the clock would reset and his plans would turn to ash. Still, he didn't let his resolve waver. He sat back down, becoming one with the shadows. Another 90 minutes ticked by. With a mere 27 minutes left on the mission's death clock, his cognition points finally hit the 700 mark. Liu Yi's eyes flew open, burning with a cold light. He drained his remaining reserves and triggered the membrane for the ultimate time. Without a shred of hesitation, he slammed the second option for the 3rd time. He instantly threw himself backward as the stone beneath his boots began to groan and shudder. He leapt clear, watching as the massive central pedestal began to sink into the floor. A triumphant, wild smirk broke across his face as he roared. I did it. The most brutal part of this mental gauntlet was finally crushed. The puzzle was clear now. It wasn't about the right answer, but about unyielding resolve. The gate only recognized a soul that would pick the same path 3 times without flinching. A hidden staircase, spiraling into the dark abyss, revealed itself before him. Gazing into the maw of the research institute, he realized this secret floor was balanced for an entire raid team. As he descended, it hit him. In the history of the game, no one had ever cleared this trial the way he just had. It demanded maxed-out skills, transcendent wisdom, and a perfect counterattack trigger. Without those specific buffs, opening that door 3 times would have been a statistical impossibility. Right now, he was the only player in the entire world with a key to this hidden floor. Louis knew he'd been playing it safe, but true desperation is the ultimate fuel for a high-stakes gamble. But there's a fine line between bravery and suicide. If he'd known his previous squad was such a pack of snakes, he never would have let his guard down long enough for them to die. He paced down a sterile, blindingly white hallway until he reached a lone door at the end. Splayed across the threshold was a mangled, blood-stained corpse. Moving closer, he saw the tattered remains of a woman. Suddenly, a pulse of light erupted, and a glowing sphere manifested in the air. Louis gasped, looking down his own chest as the orb physically tore itself away from his body. It drifted toward the corpse like a moth to a flame, fusing into the lifeless form. System alert. The malignant puppet has been purified. As the bounty for his suffering, Liu Yi was granted one of the membrane's computing power. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The notifications didn't stop. Desperate situation achievement unlocked. A landslide of legendary rewards flooded his screen as the game's core configuration began to rewrite itself. He was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the haul. Liu Yi felt his adrenaline crash. His legs turned to jelly as he slid down the wall, stowing his blade away. His knees were visibly knocking together. A dry, shaky smile slowly formed on his lips as the reality set in. He had been absolutely terrified of dying. He buried his face in his hands, feeling a wave of embarrassment at how close he'd come to the edge. Calibration complete. He raked in 22,464 XP and 400 gold. His level skyrocketed to 44. His HP pool surged to 3,720, and his knowledge power peaked at 846. His total combat power was now sitting at a formidable 898. 2 game-breaking skills unlocked. Status lock. Freezes an enemy's vitals and locks their cognition. All debuffs now cling to the target for 10 minutes at the cost of 50 cognition. This was total domination. Liu Yi pumped his fists, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd come in hoping to outplay Wei Yi, but he'd walked out having conquered the system itself. He leapt into the air, his laughter echoing through the hall in a burst of pure, unadulterated joy. Slowly, the dungeon began to pixelate and dissolve back into data around him. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, his sister and her friend had finally mastered their weapon arts. The duo looked ready for war. Elsere Vi stood at the player respawn point, her eyes scanning the crowd for Liu Yi. 6 hours had vanished since she died, and there was still no sign of the rookie. She crossed her arms, a frown deepening as she wondered where on earth he could be hiding. A ping from blazing fire broke her focus. What happened out there? Wei Yi's reply was icy, a total wipe. Blazing Fire's jaw dropped. Did Liu Yi do it? Wei Yi corrected him through gritted teeth. It was she who had fallen. Silence followed. After a moment, he replied that he'd gathered some intel and asked for the next move. Wei Yi demanded a session in the Mirror Realm. A 1,000-copy grind was the only way to recover her lost levels. Blazing Fire agreed instantly. Her final parting shot. Liu Yi was the real deal. The support powerhouse they had been searching for. Blazing Fire sat in the guild's inner sanctum, his brow furrowed as he read her report. The man sitting directly across from him noted how rare true support power was and offered a hunt in the out-of-control zone. His name was Wei Ji. He was a level 45 brawler who used his fist to talk, and he too possessed rare support abilities. He agreed to help, but his price was steep, 10,000 gold pieces. The guild president just flashed a wicked, greedy grin. Consider it paid. Wei Ji walked out of the New Order headquarters, where his partner in crime was already waiting in the shadows. Seeing him, his friend eagerly asked for the details. They were buzzing. They'd scoured the deepest corners of the web to track down the owner of that elusive support power. Wei Ji ignored the chatter and, in a fit of rage, delivered a bone-shattering kick to a nearby post, sending his friend into a trembling fit of fear. After the steam cleared, he growled that the deal was done. His friend stammered that this was only phase 1, asking why he was so worked up. Wei Ji crouched down and let out a guttural scream of frustration. He hated the fact that he wasn't the only support player on the board anymore. The competition just got lethal. They needed to rewrite their entire strategy to stay at the top of the New Order food chain. Back in the real world, Liu Yi sat in the quiet of his room, staring intensely at a sheet of paper covered in his own frantic notes. He obsessed over hash power permission, the divine authority to command the output of a world-shaping supercomputer. Was that dungeon reward just the tip of the iceberg, or was something much more sinister? Liu Yi wondered what would happen when he hit 100 computing power and how hash power was linked to the coming trial. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaustion weighing on his eyelids, but he couldn't stop. His life and his sister's depended on solving this. He finally stood up, deciding he needed a shower to wash off the digital grime before diving back into the grind. The moment he swung the door open and stepped into the hall, he ran straight into Nian Shu, who was just leaving the bathroom, towel drying her damp hair. She paused, giving him a small, friendly wave. He flashed a quick smile and waved back, making a beeline for the shower. But as he reached the door, he couldn't help but look back at her. He realized there was always this soft, captivating scent that lingered whenever she passed by. His face heated up, and he scratched his cheek, looking away in a daze. Suddenly, he snapped out of it and slapped his own face, cursing his wandering mind. He needed to get his head back in the game and lock in the goals for the next phase of the apocalypse. Minutes later, he was back in the VR world, heading straight for the crafting pavilion where the high-tier gear was forged. Stopping at the terminal, he did the grim math. He was level 44. He needed 16 more levels to hit the magic number 60. That meant 32 more nightmare dungeon clears, roughly 20 days of non-stop grinding. He only had 22 days left before the world as he knew it ended and Zhong World became the new reality. The window was razor thin. He might not make it. To top it off, his gear was lagging behind. There were two paths to meta-tier gear: pay the blood price in gold coins, or gamble on upgrading his current kit. He had 11,021 coins in his pocket, half from the dungeon jackpot and the rest from scrapping junk gear. The system prompted, craft 40 purple tier pieces for 650 coins a pop, then boost them from level 30 to 40 for another 400. He realized his set was incomplete. He was still missing his headpiece, necklace, and emblem. Combining the sets would drain 5,550 coins and take 1,100 seconds to forge. By his math, he needed a staggering 16,129 coins to reach full level 60 gear. That meant he'd have to grind 40 times harder than he'd planned. He crossed his arms, his mind spinning. To hit that goal, he'd have to stop playing it safe and start hunting for high-risk, high-reward bounties. But who was big enough to be his next target? Suddenly, a priority notification chimed, snatching his attention away. He hesitated before opening it, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. In this world, news that arrived this way only meant one thing: an absolute emergency. He gave the order to open the message and realized it was a direct ping from the guild master of New Order himself. The text was blunt. Are you free? We need to talk. Our hero froze, a bitter wave of past life trauma crashing over him. He vividly remembered how those elite bastards used to treat him like a literal doormat. They had spat in his face, saying a talentless piece of trash like him was a stain on New Order's name. After the world flipped, they dominated South China and evolved into the planet's most terrifying guild. Their philosophy is simple: only the apex predators deserve to breathe. If you have a high-tier class or rare talent, they own your life. If you're a low-level nobody, you're less than garbage. As someone who died once already, he couldn't help but feel a deep, burning hatred for the New Order crest. He scowled at the screen, reminiscing about just how pathetic and weak he had been in his previous life. He wondered what Butterfly Effect had changed their tune. Blazing Fire wrote that he was assembling a suicide squad for the out-of-control zone, but was short on manpower. Having caught wind of Liu Yi's support abilities, he was extending a golden ticket. Liu Yi asked if they were only looking for a second support. The president confirmed it, sending a jolt of nerves through our hero. Blazing Fire then dropped a flex, calling his group the undisputed strongest team on Earth. When asked why they were diving into a suicide zone, the leader kept his cards close, saying he had his reasons. Liu Yi played it cool, replying that he'd sleep on it. Once alone, he weighed the pros and cons sure, New Order players are greedy monsters who hog all the loot, but their clear speed for XP and gold is unmatched. Still, the logic didn't track. You can't fast travel to secret territories from the market, and that zone is crawling with level 70 plus nightmares. He shook off the headache for now, deciding that a gear overhaul was his first priority. The system flashed a prompt. 650 coins required to forge a purple tier artifact. The smithing was instantaneous, and a surge of power rippled through his entire loadout as his stats broke their old limits. His attack hit a staggering 9,900, defense reached 716, and intelligence hit 678, with other stats fluctuating between 134 and 2011. His HP was now a solid 6,030, with a massive cognition pool of 2,034. His total combat power was clocked at 102. Since he broke the triple-digit barrier, the system granted him the title Supreme Space Hunter, doubling his stat growth from +1 to +2 per level. The growth was explosive. Attack spiked to 11,400, defense to 892, stamina to 159, HP to 8,040, and knowledge power hit 2,712. Gazing at his new stats, Liu Yi was buzzing with hype. That combat power milestone came with some insane hidden buffs. Surpassing the 100 mark meant his base strength was now amplified by a whopping 30. He wondered if he could keep this snowball rolling. What was the next ceiling? 200? 500? Maybe even 1,000? But then, a dark thought crossed his mind, and he looked away, his brow furrowing. He realized the Battle Force system wasn't exclusive to him. If he could hit these heights, other whales definitely could too, especially the monsters handpicked by the New Order president. A squad like that was basically an army of 10 titans. If they were all this cracked, the out-of-control zone wasn't a death trap. It was an opportunity. Liu Yi fired back a message to Blazing Fire. He officially took the bait. The reply was instant. Wise choice. Blazing Fire assured him that since the team already had one support, his safety was practically guaranteed. To sweeten the pot, he tossed in a 100 coin signing bonus. Liu Yi was genuinely blindsided. He couldn't wrap his head around why the leader was being so charitable. It was clear the guy was swimming in gold, but this felt too easy. Whether there was a knife hidden behind that gold or not, he'd at least secured his next meal. He did a quick background check on the rest of the roster. The president gave him the all-clear, welcoming him to the inner circle. Satisfied, Liu Yi saw his name pop up on the party list. The official guild invite followed, which he accepted without a second thought. Immediately, the general chat lit up as the president told the veterans to greet the new blood. A guy named Wei Ji piped up, curious if Liu Yi would be a support partner. After a round of cold hellos, the president ordered a rendezvous at the North Gate. Before heading out, Liu Yi grabbed a standard knife, playing it smart. He decided to hide his high-end headpiece and carry a noob weapon to stay under the radar. If things went south, he needed a trump card they wouldn't see coming. Keeping the knife concealed was his insurance policy. In a world this cutthroat, showing your full hand is a death sentence. Arriving at the gate, he did a quick scan of his new allies. The power gap was insane. Almost everyone was at the level 50 cap, except for the two supports. As he closed the distance, he saw the elite squad waiting in a tense cluster. Blazing Fire was at the center, standing with his arms crossed, and a look of pure, concentrated arrogance. The other veterans didn't hide their curiosity, eyes like hawks as they deconstructed every detail of the newcomer's appearance. Wei Ji was the first to break the tension. He turned around, offering a surprisingly high-energy greeting. Liu Yi stepped up and gave a short, professional intro. The brawler replied with a grin, but the atmosphere remained heavy. Blazing Fire finally spoke up, noting that he'd never seen two support users in one room. Now he had two of the rarest assets in the game at his beck and call. Before they marched into the dead zone, he announced he wanted a little demonstration for the crowd. Liu Yi studied him closely. The aura this man radiated confirmed he was indeed the legendary president of New Order. He was standing face-to-face with one of the most dangerous men on the planet. The president demanded that both newcomers put their skills on display before the real hunt began. The two supports shared a brief look before Wei Ji stepped forward, volunteering to take the stage first. Liu Yi scratched his head, genuinely baffled. This audition felt redundant since they were already in the party. But the president insisted, claiming the veterans needed to trust their lifelines. Left with no choice, Liu Yi gave a curt nod, playing along with the leader's power trip. Wei Ji walked up to Blazing Fire and broke down the mechanics of his kit. He explained that his AoE, area of effect, was tied directly to the physical reach of his gear. He raised his fists, explaining his gloves only had a 1 to 2 meter radius. If he wasn't practically hugging his teammates, his buffs wouldn't land. Blazing Fire nodded, satisfied with the logical trade-off between power and range. Meanwhile, Liu Ye's mind was racing in shock. If Wei Ji was that restricted, what did that mean for him and his pistol? He'd never even thought about range before. His skills always just hit their mark regardless of distance. A cold sweat broke out as he realized how different his broken build was from a normal player. Wei Ji started to show. First, he popped a standard healing pulse. Then, he triggered his second skill, Mantra. He bragged that this was a boss killer, stacking debuffs like aging and massive slows on the target. Then came the third trick, conjuring spectral chains that locked the president's hands in place. He dubbed this Silence, a move that could shut down even the fiercest bosses. Finally, he winked, saying he'd keep his fourth skill under wraps for when things got truly messy. Blazing Fire watched the display with a predatory, satisfied smile. Liu Yi took a mental note. He'd follow the same script, show enough to be useful, but hide the real game breaker for himself. When his turn came, he stepped up, stating his blade gave him a 3 meter radius, already outclassing Wei Ji's reach. He mirrored the heal, then showed off Blessing. For his third act, Prison, he cast it directly on the president, turning the guild leader into a literal statue. The effect wore off quickly, and Liu Yi played it down, saying it lasted 10 seconds and might not stick on a boss. He added that Blessing was a universal cleanse. It could even break his own prison. And just like Wei Ji, he kept his ultimate trump card buried deep in his inventory. As he stepped back, he locked eyes with Wei Ji. He could see the burning confidence in the brawler's gaze. The guy thought he was untouchable. Blazing Fire chewed on the info before declaring he'd seen enough. With the measuring contest over, he gave the order to move out. He turned to the veterans and dropped a bombshell. In the past, they were stuck on the outskirts because they lacked support. But with 2 support gods in the mix, they were going to pierce the heart of the out-of-control zone and plunder its deepest secrets. The elite players roared with hype, punching the air as they began the march into the abyss. Liu Yi hung back, his mind spinning with questions. The loot in the chaos and out-of-control zones was nearly identical, but the death rate in the latter was a nightmare. Why the obsession? Was there something hidden in the ruins that the president wasn't telling them? He realized he'd stopped walking when he saw the group pulling ahead. Wei Ji noticed him lagging and waved him over with a loud shout. Liu Yi caught up with a fake smile, but his eyes were like flint. He knew the harsh truth of this world. There was only room for one main support on an elite team. It was only a matter of time before he'd have to retire Wei Ji. Once the rival was out of the picture, Liu Yi would be the guild's most indispensable asset. They finally crossed the border into the out-of-control zone, greeted by a hellish skeletal skyline of crumbling skyscrapers. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The captain took the lead, breaking down the rules of this twisted territory. In this zone, the world scales its hate to your party size. They were a tight 10-man squad, but the system would treat them like a massive 80-man raid. Every move had to be perfect. The captain dropped a final chilling warning. Killing mobs here was a waste of time and yielded 0 loot. If they saw a monster, they had to hide or run. And if they couldn't run, they'd start tossing disposable teammates to the wolves to let the elites escape. An oppressive, icy silence fell over the group at that encouraging news. Without a word, the captain vaulted into the air with an agile leap. He became a shadow, leaping from the ruins into the urban abyss. Like a pack of lemmings, the other veterans followed suit, diving into the dark. Liu Yi paused for a split second, his eyes scanning the ruins for any lurking threats. Then, he pushed off, plummeting after them. As he cut through the air, the shadows seemed to stretch and swallow the light. The moment his boots hit the asphalt, a jagged bolt of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the skeletal remains of the city. He glanced to his flank, spotting his teammates, and then he saw it. Perched on a jagged roof nearby was a nightmare incarnate. The creature caught their scent and let out a roar that vibrated in Liu Ye's very bones. He gritted his teeth, his hand twitching toward his weapon. Blazing Fire, cool as ice, hissed the order for everyone with stealth passives to vanish immediately. The squad scrambled like cockroaches in the light, diving for cover. But as they bolted, the monster launched itself from the roof, beginning its lethal hunt. But before it could reach them, a second, even larger shadow lunged from the darkness, intercepting the first monster with terrifying strength. The smaller beast shrieked as it was literally crushed in the Titan's fist and tossed aside like a broken toy. This new apex predator didn't stop to celebrate. It locked its eyes on the group and charged. One of the players, hearing the heavy thuds behind him, made the mistake of looking back. His face went pale as he saw the massive silhouette closing the gap. He screamed at the president, his voice cracking with panic. Man-eating leopard. We're being hunted. Their safe entry into the zone had just turned into a total disaster. Blazing Fire didn't flinch. Don't break formation, he barked, commanding them to keep running and avoid a direct fight at all costs. The squad scrambled into a cramped, dark alley, heart rates redlining as they tried to lose the beast. Wei Yi, watching from the back with a cold curiosity, began to wonder just how much power that monster was actually hiding. A veteran guildie whispered the grim truth. In a previous raid, 10 elite squads dove into this hellhole, and 5 were deleted by just one of those things. Even with that chilling story, Wei Ji just scoffed. Meanwhile, the Predator had already read their movements like an open book. Ignoring the chase, it took a brutal shortcut, smashing through a concrete wall like it was cardboard, and cut them off at the end of the alley, blocking their only exit. Without missing a beat, Blazing Fire barked an order at his blindfolded tank. Draw its aggro. Now, the warrior dug his heels in instantly, obeying the command without question. He popped his taunt skill. For 60 seconds, the leopard would be slowed by 10, but its raw damage would skyrocket in a murderous frenzy. The second the skill landed, the beast screeched to a halt, its bloodlust locking onto the lone tank. The warrior bolted in the opposite direction, dragging the apex predator away from the rest of the group. Wei Ji watched the tactical retreat with a predatory glint in his eyes, already cooking up a twisted plan to turn this chaos to his advantage. His gaze shifted toward Lu Yi, his face hardening into a mask of pure malice, without a hint of remorse. He flicked his wrist and cast a marking skill directly onto Lu Ye's back. It was a death sentence. For the next 10 minutes, every monster within a kilometer would sense Lu Yi like a beacon in the dark. The instant the curse took hold, every nightmare lurking in the ruins snaped their heads toward Lu Yi. Even the manic leopard, which was supposed to be busy with the tank, suddenly froze mid-stride. The tank cursed, screaming in confusion as the beast completely ignored his taunt and turned back. Unaware of the target on his back, Lu Yi kept running, thinking they were finally in the clear. Suddenly, a monster exploded from the shadows, lunging straight for his throat. He didn't even have a second to breathe before the beast tried to pin him, and the sheer momentum of the ambush sent him tumbling across the asphalt. The creature slammed him into a brick wall with bone-shattering force. The impact was devastating. The rest of the squad heard the crash and skidded to a stop, looking back in horror. Their jaws dropped as they saw it, a literal sea of monsters swarming from every dark corner, all converging on Lu Yi. No one could understand why the entire zone had suddenly decided he was the only target that mattered. In the middle of the carnage, a fiery aura erupted around Lu Yi as his eyes locked onto Wei Ji's. The snake-like smirk on Wei Ji's face told him everything he needed to know. It was a setup. Blazing Fire didn't hesitate for a second, charging back into the fray at full tilt. He yelled at the others to get to the safe zone while he tried to pull Lu Yi out of the meat grinder. The team screamed after him, thinking their leader had finally lost his mind for a mere support player. Wei Ji watched him go, convinced the president was committing suicide. There was no way both of them were coming back from that swarm. He turned to the group, declaring that Lu Yi was already a corpse and a dead weight they needed to cut loose. Someone tried to argue, but the conversation was cut short by the sound of a building collapsing nearby. The man-eating leopard had returned. It had completely shrugged off the taunt and was back for blood. With the situation spiraling out of control, the survivors abandoned the rescue and sprinted for the shelter. Meanwhile, Blazing Fire was a blur of motion, his eyes glued to Lu Ye's rapidly dropping health. "Don't you dare die on me," he roared. Suddenly, a monster pounced from his flank. Blazing Fire felt the killing intent and whipped out his blade, aiming for a lethal counterslash across the beast's chest. But the blade just bounced off the creature's hide without leaving a scratch. He cursed under his breath, stunned by the impossible defense of these high-level mobs. The beast swiped back with a claw that could rend steel. Blazing fire blocked it with a grunt, but the force sent him skidding back. He watched in despair, as Lu Yi was swallowed by a mountain of monsters. The odds were impossible. For a heartbeat, even he thought it was over. But then, he saw a glimmer of hope through the chaos. Even buried under a pile of claws and teeth, Lu Yi hadn't stopped fighting. The monsters were trying to tear his limbs apart, but his resolve remained unbreakable. Lu Yi triggered his freeze state, locking his cognition consumption. His HP was bleeding out, sitting at 5,036. With only 10 seconds of invulnerability left, he slammed his blessing skill. He burned every single knowledge point he had, forcing a massive attribute surge of 1,406 points. His stats went absolutely nuclear, shattering the 1,000-point barrier and peaking at over 6,000 in some categories. The power of the blessing exploded through his veins, burning away the marking curse like it was nothing. He tightened his grip on his katana, his eyes glowing with a cold, divine light. The system chimed. Energy at 2,712. Attack power boosted by 50. The counterattack was ready. With one fluid, lightning-fast motion, Lu Yi unleashed a horizontal slash. Every monster surrounding him was instantly cleaved in half, their bodies evaporating in a single strike. In that exact moment, the man-eating leopard lunged forward for the kill. It tore past blazing fire like a freight train, leveling walls in its desperate charge. Lu Yi didn't blink. He sensed the predator's every move. He caught the leopard's massive claw with his bare hand at the last possible second, halting the beast's momentum. His boots dug deep furrows into the pavement, but he didn't budge an inch. Instantly switching tactics, he ditched the blade for his pendulum gun. He procced the stun effect and jammed the barrel right against the monster's skull. As the beast roared in defiance, he pulled the trigger. The shot was a point-blank execution. Seizing the window of the stun, he swapped to his primary firearm and let out a relentless hail of lead. The leopard's body was riddled with high-velocity rounds. Until finally, the king of the zone collapsed with a crash that shook the earth. The beast lay broken and defeated. Liu Ye, with the cold calm of a true apex predator, stepped onto the monster's carcass and looked around at the remaining swarm with absolute, terrifying confidence. Beneath his feet, the leopard's body began to dissolve into digital dust. Blazing Fire could only watch, frozen in awe. He stammered that Lu Yi was a total fraud. How could a support player possess such god-tier destructive power? The system warned him. Only 50 seconds left before the blessing buff expired. Lu Yi didn't waste time gloating. He bolted toward the president, who was still standing there like he'd seen a ghost. He grabbed him, saying they needed to move before the next wave arrived. They took off at a full sprint. Blazing Fire, seeing another pack of monsters closing in from the front, finally snapped back to reality and followed, yelling for Lu Yi to lead the way to the shelter. Back at the entrance of the dungeon, the rest of the squad was huddled in the dark, praying for a miracle. One guy whispered that he hadn't heard from the president in ages. Maybe he was too scared to even check his messages. Another nodded in grim agreement. Wei Ji, trying to hide his smugness, asked why they were still waiting. Who could possibly survive that literal hell? One of the veterans pointed at the party UI. They're still alive, he said. He figured their health bars were only holding up because of some emergency damage nullification skills. But he knew Lu Yi was in deep trouble. Somehow, that kid had pulled the aggro of the entire zone, and there was no coming back from that. It was a tragedy. After saying this, he crossed his arms, grinding his teeth in frustration at their looming failure. Suddenly, a scout screamed, "I see them on the radar. They're right outside the shelter." Wei Ji's jaw hit the floor. He couldn't believe his ears. The rest of the group erupted in cheers. Amidst the excitement, the veteran warned that they might be bringing a horde with them and ordered everyone to lock and load for a base defense. The team lined up at the entrance, weapons drawn and ready. But strangely, it was silent. Nodos, notus. Then, the guild president stepped through the door, with Lu Yi walking right beside him. The room exploded with relief as everyone celebrated the impossible return of their leaders. Only Wei Ji stood in the corner, his face twisted in a dark scowl. To him, this president was becoming a massive obstacle in his path. The players crowded around Blazing Fire, praising his legendary skill for surviving the swarm and saving Lu Yi against all odds. And that's a wrap for today, guys. Did you enjoy this epic turn of events? I know I did. If you're hyped for the next chapter of this manhwa recap, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Catch you in the next one. Stay tuned.